vaccines are safe.
Very, very, very low risk of getting a myocarditis.
If you are not vaccinated, you remain at risk.
Comedian Nick Nemiroff dead at age 32. Teen equestrian star Sienna Knowles hospitalized with blood clots after Pfizer vaccine. You've done one hell of a job in making sure that they've made a lot of money. And I yield back.
We need to put these people in jail.
The vaccine industry is disgusting.
The American government, there's no shame.
An FDA investigation into safety issues.
They triggered a very comprehensive review of all databases in existence, and they discovered nothing.
That's it right there. This is not a conspiracy theory.
I should be prosecuted.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here and traveling long distances to come talk with us. As I travel across the country, whether I'm at home in Georgia or anywhere else, one of the questions Americans ask me the most is, what is Congress doing about the vaccine injuries and deaths that have been reported after receiving the COVID-19 vaccine? And when will people be held accountable? I asked myself these same questions. As a member of Congress, I was personally banned from Twitter for all of 2022 for calling out the dangers of the COVID vaccines and for questioning the injuries and deaths that were being reported. I have introduced pieces of legislation demanding accountability and justice for the victims of the government's forced COVID vaccine mandates and their partners in Big Pharma by stripping Big Pharma's liability protections. After all, Big Pharma was paid billions of dollars by the American taxpayers to make these vaccines. As a member of the COVID Select Committee, I hope this hearing today will offer a voice to those who have been injured by these vaccines or have lost loved ones to them. While I myself am unvaccinated, I have tremendous compassion for those who trusted the government and took the vaccine, along with millions of Americans who were forced to take the vaccines. But those that suffer from vaccine injuries or lost loved ones to the vaccines must be heard. The objective of this hearing is to explore potential links between COVID-19 vaccination and adverse events thereafter, including reports of conditions such as myocarditis, pericarditis, blood clots, neurological damage, cardiac arrest, miscarriages, menstrual fertility issues, and so much more. The information presented here will in part be based on data available from the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, known as VAERS, managed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Since 2021, when the U.S. government started forcing vaccinations on Americans, from federal government workers and contractors to military service members to young children in schools to everyone in between, there have been concerning reports of all kinds of terrible injuries. Going forward, we will hear from patients who have suffered some of these injuries, in some cases, life-altering ones. We will also hear from expert doctors who have bravely sounded the alarm on these vaccines since they were mandated on Americans, and who have witnessed firsthand in their practice some of the horrible effects that have resulted from vaccination. Two such doctors who are here with us today are Dr. Robert Malone and Dr. Kimberly Biss. Mr. Thomas Renz, an attorney who has represented DoD whistleblowers, is also here today. We thank all three of them for coming today to share their knowledge and perspectives with the American people. I'd like to go ahead and let each of you introduce yourselves. Dr. Biss, we'll start with you first.
Good afternoon. Push. It's on. It's green, you're good. Okay. I'm new at this. Apologize. I'm Kimberly Biss. I'm an OBGYN. I graduated medical school in 1993. I trained in Florida, and I've been in private practice ever since 1998. If you include my residency training and my private practice years, I've probably been involved in roughly 8,000 pregnancies. I am here in front of you today to testify, but I must say this ahead of time that I do not sit here today and represent my employer. I do not sit here today and represent the hospital that I'm on good standing in. I'm here today to talk about what I've experienced in my private practice and has brought great concern. So, yep.
Thank you, Dr. Biss. Dr. Malone?
My name is Robert Malone. I'm a U.S. trained physician and scientist. My license is through the state of Maryland. I was trained at Northwestern University for medical school, also Harvard University for a postgraduate fellowship, UC Davis clinically, and UC San Diego and the Salk Institute of Molecular Biology and Virology. I was made a series of discoveries as a graduate student in the late 80s that gave rise to 9 issued patents that cover the platform technology of the use of mRNA and these lipid nanoparticles for purposes of vaccination and other indications. I've testified widely here and throughout the world over the last 3 years and objecting, as you have, Ms. Greene, concerning these issues, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to testify again today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malone. Mr. Renz?
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Tom Renz, licensed in Ohio, attorney. I've been practicing and fighting in the COVID realm actually since 2020. We filed our first major case against the lockdowns in September of 2020. At that point, we attested and provided hard evidence that masks didn't work, social distancing didn't work. We knew at that point, based on the epidemiology, through scientists, through partners, that this was going to end up being roughly as dangerous as a very bad seasonal flu, but not as bad as the original SARS or the original MERS, yet we shut down our country for it. We then moved into the vaccines, an untested product that was put out and basically the public was experimented on. It's not gone well. A lot of people have said, why does the lawyer keep testifying? Why isn't it all doctors? Well, my job as an attorney is this. On Robert's dumbest day, he's smarter than I'll ever be. So what I do is I take Robert, I take Peter McCullough, I take the scientist, I translate what they're saying into English, something that we as lawyers or a judge or a jury can understand. My role is to communicate this. So what I do is I translate facts into plain language. And that's what we've been doing. We've gathered an immense amount of evidence, and everything I testify to today, unless I note otherwise, has probably either been submitted to court, so if I lied, I lose my license, or submitted to some other place where the same thing would apply. So thank you.
Thank you very much, all three of you. And I'd also like to thank the members and Senator Johnson that have come today for this important hearing. I'd now like to yield time to Senator Johnson.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. First of all, for holding this. I put on our first event in June of 2021 in Milwaukee to just allow 5 vaccine-injured individuals to tell their story. My hope was that the media would show some ounce of sympathy for their plight. That didn't happen. I've held a number of other public events like you're doing here today, and always the focus has been on the vaccine injured because they deserve to be seen and heard and believed, because they deserve treatment. No matter what percent of doses result in an injury, we can't ignore the plight of the vaccine injured. So again, I really appreciate you doing this. I do have a chart that's been censored a number of times. I don't know if you can get it up behind me. This is CDC and FDA's own numbers, and yet, you know, through all the social media censorship unconstitutionally directed by the Biden administration, people just don't want to see this. But these are the true numbers. The first 5 drugs that are listed here, this is over 28 years of reporting on the VAERS system and the FAERS system, the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System. You can see ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are pretty safe drugs, as is dexamethasone. The 2 drugs below, this is since the COVID pandemic, remdesivir, and the COVID vaccines. Now, I don't know how anybody can take a look at our response to COVID and not claim it was anything but a miserable failure. We're 4% of the world's population. We experienced supposedly 16% of the deaths. The VAERS system on the COVID vaccines alone, 1.6 million adverse events, 36,501 deaths. Now, these are worldwide figures, which are a little bit different than what you're showing in terms of U.S. figures. These are worldwide deaths. It's important to point out, though, of that 36,501 deaths, 8,923 deaths occurred either on the day of vaccination or within day 1 or 2. Now there's always two complaints about the VAERS system. One, it doesn't prove causality, which is true, but when you have that correlation of 24.4% of the deaths occurring on day 0, 1, or 2, it certainly is a correlation I would be concerned about, and I'm just not quite sure why the FDA, CDC, NIH are not concerned about it, or the general medical community. I do want to just quickly, and I'll do this quickly, talk about the oversight letters I've written trying to get this information. During most of my public events, I always invited the heads or the representatives of the federal health agencies or of Pfizer, Moderna, or Johnson & Johnson to come and discuss this with people like Dr. Malone, Peter McCulloch, and the other experts I've had on my panels. They've never shown up. We had Dr. Peter Hotez, a real vaccine proponent, turned down, I think it's up to $2.6 million donation to his charity just to debate a lawyer about medical, RFK Jr. He won't do it. That tells you something. But what also is pretty revealing is in the 60 oversight letters I've written to the FDA, the CDC, Department of Defense, the NIH, in some aspect of COVID, I've virtually gotten no response. I just want to talk about three general efforts. The first I want to talk about is the standard operating procedure that the FDA, CDC issued on how they were going to analyze their safety surveillance systems. So I first wrote a letter in June of 2022 because the CDC was non-responsive to a Freedom of Information Act asking for those documents, the proportional reporting ratios, that the analysis they're going to do, and then eventually the empirical Bayesian analysis. They didn't respond. Then we found out that, again, they weren't going to be doing PRRs, they were going to be doing Bayesian analysis, but that was the FDA was going to do that, not the CDC. So it's, bottom line, cut to the chase here, it's been over a year and a half since I first tried to get that analysis of their own safety surveillance system, and they won't show it to us. You have to ask the question, why? Again, this is information the American public has a right to know. These are public servants, but they are so arrogant that they believe that they're not accountable to the American people, that they don't have to respond to congressional oversight. The other effort was regarding hot lots. This was pointed out by a fellow named Craig Party Cooper and Jessica Rose. There was one lot of Moderna had 5,297 adverse events reported in the VAERS system. This goes back to December 3rd, 2021. So within the first year, one lot had 5,297 adverse events reported. The worst flu vaccine lot ever reported had 137. There were 256 different lots of the vaccines in total that had more than 500 adverse events reported. And yet, the response I get from the CDC or the FDA is even though you show them the data, they write back, say, FDA's analysis of counts of serious adverse events reported by COVID-19 vaccine lot numbers showed no unusual concentration reports with a single lot or small group of lots. So again, they are just willfully blind. They just, with impunity, you just say, we see nothing here, so quit asking questions. The last attempt was my 60th oversight letter, and this had to do with an FDA-funded, and now I found out it's an FDA-conducted study that concluded the study found statistically significant signals for myocarditis and pericarditis, but also In the primary analysis, seizures, convulsions met the statistical threshold for a signal in children aged 2 to 4 years following Pfizer vaccination in all three databases, and in children aged 2 to 5 following Moderna vaccination. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is this was again, not only funded, but conducted with senior FDA officials. The results they concluded the data collection in April of 2023. They issued on September 12th, 2003, after an advisory committee on immunization practices, they advised that every American 6 months and up get these vaccines. Even though they'd conduct a study, the data being collected ended in April, that it has signals for myocarditis, pericarditis, and seizures. They didn't publish their report until a month after the committee recommended the immunization. What is going on here? So again, when you cannot get information that the American public deserves, when people don't show up for events like this, and just be willing to engage in discussion or debate with eminently qualified doctors and vaccine experts, all they do instead is they denigrate, they vilify, they try and destroy their careers. Something's not right. Something smells to high heaven. So again, I just really appreciate you holding this hearing, and I'll turn it over to the House members now. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you so much for writing so many strongly worded letters that were never answered. And that's our issue, our frustration as members of Congress. We ask questions, we send letters, we demand answers on behalf of the American people, and we don't get them. So that should tell everyone what they need to know about this administration. I'd now like to yield time to Congressman Massie as I pass this microphone over.
Thank you very much, Marjorie. Should I call you Chairwoman?
Chairwoman.
Okay. This is a sorely needed hearing. It really is, and I applaud you for taking the initiative to put it together and get some great witnesses here for us. You know, Senator Johnson mentioned that there was the VAERS database. There's also the vSafe database, and whereas the government set up VAERS and then they went about denigrating the results that came from VAERS, but there was another system set up specifically for the COVID vaccines called vSafe. 10 million people volunteered to participate. And these aren't people who randomly self-report. These are 10 million people in a study to determine the safety of the vaccine. These are 10 million vaccine enthusiasts, COVID vaccine enthusiasts, because these were the first ones to get the vaccine before the mandates were put in place. And what we've learned after CDC reluctantly let go, after FOIA after FOIA after FOIA and lawsuit, they finally released some of this data on the 10 million people who were participating in vSafe. 700,000 sought medical care after getting the vaccine. 700,000. And 70% of those were either hospitalized, went to the emergency room, or received urgent care. This is astounding to me. And then the Bayesian analysis that the FDA conducted that Senator Johnson talked about, they still haven't released that. And they're fighting in court to get another 18 months because for some reason, they don't think it's fair to the drug companies or something if they release this data. So that's the most frustrating thing about this is the government has this information. It's not private companies that are hiding this. vSafe, by the way, didn't involve the vaccine companies. This was straight to the CDC. It was set up specifically to monitor that. And, they've got a term called vaccine deniers or, whatever kind of vaccine hesitancy. What about the people who just ignore and have ignored for 3 years the injuries that are happening to these children? What is the word for them? I think we need a word for them, but instead of just going on, I'd like to hear from some of our witnesses. Dr. Malone, I remember in the beginning when your name came up, they immediately tried to cancel you and say you weren't a legitimate inventor. So I went to the U.S. Patent Office and read your patents. Can you tell us just a little bit about how this method of developing vaccines came about, and why you were hesitant to embrace it even though you invented it.
Thank you, Mr. Massie, and thank you for your service. The technology involves the use of gene therapy technology to produce an immune response. There's a lot of different things that you can use gene transfer technology for, and one of the easiest things to do is to cause your body to mount an immune response. The challenge with standard gene therapy is that it's often associated with DNA recombination, which is a form of genotoxicity. It can cause toxic effects to your genome. The fundamental concept of RNA-based gene therapy and vaccines is that you use a short-lived molecule, messenger RNA, which needs only to get to the cytoplasm, the outer part of the cell, not all the way into where the genome is in the nucleus, and then produce a protein in order to cause your body to mount an immune response similar to if you were infected with the virus, without having the whole virus there. Did that make sense? So that's the core concept. That concept goes back, I think, to 1987.
Was it true you were trying to do gene therapy, and this was a sort of a side?
I was working in one of the top gene therapy labs in the world, that of Dr. Inder Verma, and was seeking as a graduate student to ask some basic science questions about how RNA gets assembled into a certain type of virus called a retrovirus. In order to ask the questions, I had to develop some fundamental systems for manufacturing large quantities of RNA, being able to have it make protein and deliver it into cells. And that led to a series of discoveries, and this was just a logical consequence, an unintended one. Having made those findings, I had the insight that this could be used for vaccine purposes or gene therapy purposes using a non-viral delivery system, which is very much swimming upstream since I was in a viral gene therapy vector lab. But that's how it came to pass. Thank you for your question.
And how did that knowledge give you some insight into why these vaccines might not be for everybody, or why they might have some unintended consequences?
So to be honest, Mr. Massie, I took the vaccine. I took 2 doses of Moderna, and my second dose was one of the hot lots or bad lots, and I suffered significant adverse events, and I still continue to be medically treated for those. Nowhere near as significant as that of many of the vaccine injured, but nevertheless, that's the case, cardiac damage, et cetera. I accepted the product because I had been reassured by the both the developers that had worked on it after I had, the technology developers that had further advanced that technology, particularly Dr. Peter Cullis of the University of British Columbia, who should have received that Nobel Prize, by the way, and also by leadership at FDA, that these products were safe and effective and I shouldn't be concerned about them. But my initial objection was that they were being deployed without true informed consent. That was my original objection. I wrote about that very early on in 2021 in an article in Trial Site News, where I objected to the lack of informed consent and the coercion, compulsion, and enticement that were being deployed both for adults and then for children, particularly in Canada at the time. So that's what led me into this. And I was told by Peter Marks, I actually set up a call with him. It was attended by a representative of the press office at the FDA, in which I raised my objections after having read the what's called non-technical or non-clinical common technical document that had been obtained from the government of Japan, from Pfizer, which disclosed a wide range of adverse events and some very questionable data on where these particles go. You'll recall that we were told that these particles would stay after injection into the deltoid. This is more of the propaganda that was a lie. We were told officially, and physicians, my physician colleagues were told that after injection into the arm, into the shoulder, these products would only deliver their payload to the draining lymph nodes. But the Pfizer documents clearly demonstrated that they went all over the body and had an unusual predilection for ovarian tissue, among others. When I read that and then read more details, I became alarmed and spoke out about this on a podcast that was widely viewed in the face of all of the suppression of information that was occurring in corporate media. This was the infamous Dark Horse podcast, in which I mentioned that the spike protein was a toxin. This is another thing that I was ridiculed for, but now the data clearly demonstrate that, in fact, the spike protein, the payload that is produced in your body by these inoculations, is in fact toxic to you. It is biologically active. It was not made inert. And technically, this is the engineered spike protein, which originated arguably at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and then had some further modifications which did not reduce its toxicity. So those were my original objections, is the payload was toxic, and the distribution of the particles demonstrated that the problems that I had observed and had caused me to abandon the technology in the 90s as an academic still remained, even though I had been assured that they had been resolved. And from that, I became a champion of the importance of informed consent to the population and the importance of transparency concerning the data that was evolving and has continued to evolve concerning the adverse events. Have I answered your question, sir?
Yes, very, very well. And I know we don't have a clock here, so I'm going to yield back because I know, even though I have tons of questions to ask. Okay, we'll do another round. I yield back. Ms. Greene.
Thank you, Congressman Massie. Thank you very much, Dr. Malone. I'd like to yield time to Congressman Warren Davidson.
Looks like we'll hot swap here. Here we are. Thanks again, Chairwoman, for organizing this great hearing. And it highlights, something that we run into. You have the committee structure in Congress, and sometimes it's hard to make the committees even do the things that I think the people really want to do. And hopefully, collectively, we do a better job of that. But we can at least hold meetings. And Senator Johnson, thank you for being someone who's done that consistently on this topic and many others. But I want to thank you guys for your courage for working against the tide in this issue and so publicly. I think there are a lot of members of Congress who have concerns. We all have constituents who have concerns. And maybe to pick up, Dr. Malone, where you left off on this spike protein and the way the mRNA works, a lot of my constituents expressed alarm about the way that it worked, and they were on the other end of informed consent. They were fully coerced into doing this. I had multiple constituents sobbing because they, had to do this in order to keep their job, and they weren't in a position where they could say, I can lose my job. They were compelled to take this vaccine, and they were very concerned about the effects. And, some of them you've highlighted, but the other thing that maybe you're right on the edge of talking about is that this leaves a persistent marker, has been a concern that's expressed to me. And I just want to address, does it leave a persistent marker? And then if you wanted to deliver additional drugs or anything else, could you target based off of the marker that is now in the tissue of people who have had mRNA vaccines?
Okay, so this relates to one of the theories that have been circulated widely. I'll be careful in my language, on social media, that can be summarized as these products represent self-assembling lipid nanoparticles which function as nanobots. nanobots being a Star Trek technology, and there's some that assert that these can reprogram your brain. Now, I'm going to try to be quite precise in my response, recognizing that I don't know everything, and neither do any of us, including the pharmaceutical companies at this point. Number one, these products remain in your body. This is not natural RNA. This is, by the FDA's own words, a modified messenger RNA. It incorporates a synthetic molecule that is not present in your body, a methylated pseudouridine. This is a different molecule than the one for which the Nobel Prize was recently granted. So this is a modification, chemically modified. We don't know precisely how long these products remain in your body. So the assertion that these products would only last, this modified messenger RNA, we were told, would only last in your body for minutes to hours, that was another lie, one that was readily debunked by doing some simple studies that normally the FDA would have required. These are called pharmacokinetics and pharmacodistribution. Now, we have now learned that these products are contaminated, and the current arm wrestling is whether or not that level of contamination meets the criteria for the federal CFR statute that defines adulteration. The FDA denies that they meet that criteria, and yet they appear in many laboratories to meet that criteria. This DNA fragment contamination is asserted by the FDA to not represent a hazard to one's genome. But prior versions of the FDA, let's say, from prior administrations concerning DNA vaccines, a closely related technology, highlighted this risk. As I'll provide in my sworn comments, a Moderna patent specifically highlights these risks as a potential advantage of mRNA-based technology, that it does not have DNA. If those DNA molecules insert themselves into the genome of your constituents, that would potentially be a marker. I don't see evidence that these particles were intentionally engineered as potential genetic markers. But I can certainly understand the concern, because we have not, the public has not been well informed about the true nature of these. The composition of matter has been hidden. I can't tell you, in all honesty, everything that is in the tube that is being administered through the needle into your constituents, because in large part that has been intentionally hidden. It's been hidden by contract all over the world. We've had some disclosures that have been more open from the TGA, the Australian version of the FDA, but we don't really know. We haven't had open transparency, as was testified by Mr. Johnson. So in sum, I can see some scenarios wherein your constituents might have genomic modification, particularly associated with the DNA fragment contamination. I also can understand and concur that it is technically possible that these modified mRNA molecules that are not really mRNA may persist for a long period of time, and so those could be markers that could be identified. And I acknowledge that we don't have open transparency and full disclosure about all the contents of these products that are being administered to your constituents. And so it's technically possible there are things there which might be used at some future time to identify those that are compliant versus non-compliant.
Yeah, once a great, very thorough answer, and once there's a marker, you could do whatever with it, I guess. But that's the question. A lot of people have that concern that there's somehow now a genetic marker because of the vaccine. And I think the other thing is, if you look in total, and I think the Operation Warp Speed, the idea that, look, we need to move with a sense of urgency, maybe not at the pace that government is historically not very effective at, seemed appealing up front, but now with the benefit of hindsight, could we assess that Warp Speed was successful or not?
In my opinion, what we've learned, remember it's now 4 years. In my opinion, what we've learned is that the collective wisdom of decades of regulatory science as it relates to vaccines and other medical products was appropriate. There is a reason why these products typically require up to a decade to be proven to be safe and effective. And it was not prudent and not in the interests of protecting the citizens of the United States or the world to bypass those time-tested processes that have basically been agreed upon through various forms of informal international treaties in order to, my words are, jam a product through a process in order to get it out to respond to a false threat. Remember, the underlying thesis here is that we had 3.4% case fatality rate. This was told to us again and again and again, and it was a lie.
Yeah, the underlying case fatality rate. There's so many, so many lies. I hope they all get exposed. But I think the last question I have is just, you think about the frustration that a lot of people have is, what do they see Congress doing? They see us talking about it. They see us posting on social media about it, maybe giving interviews, writing letters, but we don't see changes. So
and you don't see accountability.
And we don't see any real accountability. And I think it'll take probably longer, but if you just look at structurally, we've got the CDC, the NIH, the FDA. We have Fauci saying, basically boasting to Senator Rand Paul that I don't have to tell you how much money I'm making from this. It's specifically excluded by law from the public disclosure. It clearly seems that there's some structural problems. Have any of you given thought to how we ought to restructure this? I think status quo, we could pretty much uniformly agree needs to end, and we need to change it somehow. Has anyone in the field, maybe you know somebody else who really has given a lot of thought to the structure? I'll point out that in Congress, we don't even have a healthcare committee. All this jurisdiction is broken up, and we don't even, and when you don't have a dedicated committee, you don't have a dedicated oversight function. So all Ways and Means oversight function and Energy and Commerce's oversight function are divided amongst everything else in their jurisdiction. So I think the most basic thing is Congress needs a dedicated healthcare committee. But when you look in the executive branch, any thoughts from anyone, and then I'll pass the mic.
I've spoken. I have thoughts on this, and I've spent a lot of time, but I want to yield to my colleagues first. Tom.
The fundamental issue that we face is the same issue we've faced since 2020. It's a complete lack of transparency. If you want to fix this, we need to go to transparency. One of the things that's interesting is Senator Johnson mentioned VAERS. You mentioned a couple different tracking systems. I can tell you that we have an October 2020 meeting that was held by the FDA where they listed a number of systems that they were going to use to track vaccine injuries. The government knows precisely what's going on. And in fact, if we look, the FDA had broken down prior to the emergency use authorization into passive and active surveillance. CDC, VAERS, those sorts of things were considered passive. The FDA BEST system, B-E-S-T, the FDA CMS partnership, were both, these are government databases, right? So CMS pays the bills. You get a breakdown of what your bills you're paying, and those can be data mined. They're being data mined, but they're lying about it. I have evidence that they're lying about it, and let me share that. Project Salus, we broke I think in 2022, somewhere, we broke news that we had obtained a document from Project Salus. Project Salus is a DoD project, and it's done through some sort of an AI partnership. I believe Umetrics is the partner. I can provide you the document. Within that, they talk extensively about the data mining they were doing from Medicare, Medicaid systems. They were watching what was happening. In fact, in that document, which I believe I broke, I want to say that was October or November of 2021 or 2022. It's running together. But when we broke that, I have video of Fauci out there telling everybody that this is a crisis of the unvaxxed. The hospitals are full of the unvaxxed. We're all dying that are unvaxxed. Meanwhile, the Project Salus document talks about 70% of new cases being in unvaxxed and 61% of hospitalizations being in unvaxxed, or fully vaxxed. So you have 61% of cases, hospitalizations, in fully vaxxed in the Medicare population, according to the DOD's own document. Meanwhile, you have Fauci out there lying through his teeth and running around telling the public, go get your jab. This was absurd. The lack of transparency is the fundamental issue that we're facing here. The number one thing that Congress can and should do is focus on transparency. But I think, credit to Congresswoman Greene, you know, she has this hearing because nobody's asking these questions. We have 5, 10, brave congressmen here, and you can pretty much count who's here, and I could have pretty much guessed who would have been here. We don't even ask questions. We're not even asking the basic questions. How is it that at Senator Johnson's roundtable, we break data on DMED, and we allege. Now remember, I'm a lawyer, not a scientist, but we allege, I had video from 4 different people taking this off the DMED status. We verified this data every way we could. We put out there and we allege that the DOD is poisoning its own soldiers. Do you know what response we got? None. To this day, well over a year later, there is no response from the DOD under oath. Not one. Not one. All we got was a simple statement to a fact checker. Senator Johnson's written on it. Has it happened? Has it happened? Have we gotten anything under oath? Has there been testimony under oath? Right? Because I don't trust them. They've lied nonstop. And the question we should be asking ourselves is, when do you trust a liar? The CDC, the FDA, Anthony Fauci, these guys have not stopped lying from the beginning. Why in God's name do we keep trusting them? So the solution? Transparency legislation.
Thank you. And I'll just say one thing on that. We did get in the NDAA study that DOD would have to produce that would provide the results of all their vaccinated soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, all that stuff. So that was a small win, but it still isn't yet implemented.
Thank you very much, Congressman Davidson. Mr. Renz, you're right. When do you trust a liar? Never. And I appreciate that. Dr. Biss, I'd like to talk with you for a few minutes. Reading your resume here, and it's quite impressive. You're a certified OBGYN. You serve on many committees, even being chairman of the OBGYN department, and you're here on your own, out of your own capacity. You've been involved with about 8,000 pregnancies. That's a lot of babies. That's a lot of women. So I'm very impressed with your expertise. I want to talk to you a little bit. I've read so many reports and heard so many women that were vaccinated talk about issues they had with menstrual cycles, pregnancies. So I just have a few questions about this. How many of your patients did you see have increases in menstrual cycles, menstrual hemorrhages, all kinds of issues after receiving the COVID-19 vaccine, and were there clear changes for them?
Yeah, I don't have data for that. I wasn't tabulating that. Dr. James Thorpe has published many.
I have a little data.
And that's data from the VAERS, yes. Dr. Thorpe has published several articles in the last few years showing that there were definitely changes in women's menstrual cycles and also in postmenopausal patients. So those are women that have gone through the menopause and started bleeding for no structural reason, no tumors and whatnot. What was of grave concern, too, in these reproductive age women is a lot of them were having what's called passing a decidual cast, which is where normally a menstrual period will last 5 or 6 days. Imagine if you have your 5 or 6 day menstrual period all combined into an hour where your entire lining of your uterine cavity is shed all at once. It's very painful. It causes hemorrhaging. Prior to the injections, I don't call them vaccines, there were 40 case reports of this event in our literature. Dr. Thorpe published almost 300 women that this had happened to. And what's really of concern is not all of those women were vaccinated, but they had been around other people who had been vaccinated. So isn't that interesting? So yes, I've seen in my practice an increase. I've had to do surgery on patients that we just couldn't manage their bleeding, you know, with the traditional hormonal methods and whatnot, and I've had to do hysterectomies on some of those patients as well.
That is so sad. You mentioned menopause. Of course, we know menopause comes later in life for women. Were these women, what age women were experiencing menopause after receiving the vaccines?
So, I mean, it varies as far as experienced bleeding in the menopause or went through menopause. The normal age of menopause is in the early 50s. The age range that's considered normal is anywhere between 45 and 55. There were some women who received these injections and went through what's called premature ovarian failure, which is early menopause. Usually that's classified prior to the age of 40.
Jeez.
A woman from France contacted me. She was a secretary in a gynecology office, and she said it was interesting to them because they had been tracking this, and it depended on where in the menstrual cycle the woman was when she received the injections. And if she was in the post-ovulatory phase and received the injections, those women were more likely to develop amenorrhea, which is lack of menses or go into premature ovarian failure. If they had received them early in the menstrual cycle, they were the ones that had the abnormal bleeding, you know, the change in their bleeding pattern. So that was pretty interesting. They had a small case, you know, cohort of patients, but I found that a little interesting.
How many of your patients or pregnant women that you know of experience miscarriages after taking the COVID-19 vaccines or injections?
Yeah, so a lot of that was hard to, I will tell you that I looked at my pregnancy population in the fall of last year, everybody that was pregnant in our practice, and our vaccination rate in that patient population was about 60%. That's pretty commensurate with Florida because last I checked in the CDC site, the vaccination rate in Florida overall was about 65 to 70%. Most of our pregnant patients received 3 injections. Very few received 4 or more. And what's concerning is the majority of the patients received their injections in 2021 and early 2022. However, we're still seeing lingering effects. I have a great Substack that Jessica Rose published in November of 2022, which shows my data in pictorial form that's pretty right there behind you. So I went back to January of 2020, and this data went up to the beginning of November of 2022. I will tell you in 2020, we had very many newly registered obstetric patients, which is what the blue bars represent. Those are first trimester newly pregnant patients. We had the most deliveries we've had, and probably wink, wink, that was due to the lockdowns. We did also have what was considered the normal pregnancy loss rate. Now, what's quoted in my obstetric textbook and in some articles is that a normal miscarriage rate is 13 to 15%. I've never seen that clinically. There was a study that came out in 2020 by a gentleman named Naert, N-A-E-R-T, et al., that showed the actual miscarriage rate in the first trimester is 5 to 6%, and even that's a little high from what I've seen. My average miscarriage rate in 2020, month to month, was 4%. That was normal. I had done a video where I wrongly said that my miscarriage rate had increased by 50% because I was put on the spot and I didn't have my data in front of me. I was wrong. My miscarriage rate from year to year went up 100%. In 2021, the average miscarriage rate month to month was 7 to 8%. We peaked in November of that year for some reason. That's actually when a non-clinical staff member came up to me and said, Dr. Biss, do you realize we've had 8 miscarriages this month, which in a practice that delivers 20 to 25 patients, that's a huge number. In 2022, the average month-to-month rate was 15%. Now, that was up till November. I will tell you in December, I've never seen this before. We had 41 newly registered patients. 13 of them lost their babies, so that's 25% right there. And then in January and February of 2023, it still remained high. Didn't normalize until June of this year, then went up a little bit and came down in September. So we're still seeing effects. You asked how many patients had the vaccine and then lost their babies. That's hard to determine. I mean, I can tell you 60% of my patients got vaccinated, but the problem is if they're brand new to the practice, I haven't seen them yet because I'm the only person in my practice that asks every patient, have you gotten a vaccine? How many? Which brand? When? Have you had COVID? How many times? Because whether we like it or not, that's part of your medical history now. I'm the only one that asks those questions. So the problem is if a woman miscarries and you ask them, well, did you get an injection? You may come across accusatory to that person. So that's information. You don't want to ever make a woman feel like she caused her baby to not be born. So it's hard to get the exact data in all those patients.
Of course. Do you find a correlation with miscarriages and certain vaccines, whether it's Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the majority of our patients got Pfizer. The majority was Pfizer. I don't have that breakdown as far as the percentage.
Okay, thank you. I want to come back to this, but right now I'd like to yield time down here to Congressman Higgins.
Thank you, Marjorie. Dr. Malone, this is certainly not my area of expertise, but you and I have met and spoken before, and I'm like many of my colleagues, I've invested hundreds of hours into careful research and reading and listening to men and women from across the world that do have expertise in this field. And from the very beginning, when I met Dr. Fauci, I didn't trust him from the moment I met him. And I began to have, I'm suspicious by nature perhaps because of my background, but I generally don't trust the government. And the COVID pandemic appeared to me to be born of a weaponized virus. It was sticky. It injured, weakened, and sickened as opposed to kill, which is always a goal for a biological or chemical weapon in military conflict. Is one dead soldier is one dead soldier, but one weak and sick soldier requires a couple of soldiers to help them. So you decrease the impact effectiveness of that force with a chemical or biological weapon that's designed to cause weakness and fatigue, illness, sickness, for a long period of time. And COVID appeared to check all those boxes to me, just as a reasonable man with 6 decades of life. It appeared to me to be weaponized. And then studies, began to be completed across the world. And there was further suspicion behind this thing. This is before the vax. And we began to really question exactly what was the connection between the massive entities, the pharmaceutical giants that were going to create the vax in a few different forms, and you had a population that was being groomed across the world, just begging for this vax. To me, it appeared untested. I damn sure wasn't getting it. My family wasn't taking it, and yet the world was incredibly receptive to the idea of this untested vax. So some of us, being investigators, by background and nature, we started looking into the ingredients, which you call the contents of this vaccine, as it began to be rolled out. Like, what the hell was in this stuff? And some of those contents were protected by law, proprietary protection for non-active ingredients and binders, etc. But some other nations, reflective of their own laws, they had, across the world, released different list of contents. And we began to compare those as the translations became reliable. And one of the suspected contents in the vax is graphene. You've heard it, you've read it. I'd like to hear your opinion about it, because I've read and did many legitimate scientific research papers that appears to be a dosing experiment and the graphene is somehow included in that. It could be the most nefarious, worldwide conspiracy to decrease the population of the world by decreasing the birth rate by large percentages, as Dr. Biss has noted here. Many studies support that. The long-term injury and impact of not just the COVID as a virus, but the vax itself is quite significant. Is difficult to discount when you have thousands and thousands of legitimate scientific reports from across the world. They come into similar conclusions. So I ask your opinion, sir, on just how deep is this rabbit hole?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Higgins, and the opportunity to address it. Graphene oxide is a known environmental contaminant. It's readily present in the environment at different levels and often contaminates many things. Graphene oxide is even used in the wax that I have on my black car. So there's a common environmental contaminant, widely available, and to the extent, so this is an issue which has come up repeatedly over the last 3 years, and has been examined at length and often generated quite a bit of heat and controversy. In my opinion, we have more significant concerns in the range spectrum of things to be worried about. Graphene oxide contamination, which is difficult to definitively demonstrate and can be an artifact of how one analyzes the samples.
That makes sense.
Does not seem to be in my opinion, professional opinion, anywhere near as much of a concern as the DNA fragment contamination that comes from manufacturing process 2, which was rapidly deployed. So that's a proven genotoxicity risk. And right now, we have European Medicines Agency, Health Canada, and the FDA acknowledging that it exists, not having communicated that fact to the general public, not having disclosed it to physicians, and in some cases not even having apparently been completely aware of that contamination and the nature of that contamination coming from the DNA templates that produce the RNA. So in my opinion, graphene oxide remains largely an unresolved issue, to be honest with you. And the reason it's unresolved is because most of the regulatory agencies worldwide have conceded to contract terms that the sampling of vials, in other words, lot release testing, by governments, which is usually done independently of the manufacturer to verify that the specifications the manufacturer says are being followed are in fact being followed. In most nation states, that's been prohibited by contract. and there's been prohibition to actually sample those vials. So, for instance, those.
So you're saying that, sir, in the interest of time, that there's no guarantee that there wasn't cross-contamination during sampling of the vials.
There's no guarantee
that.
there wasn't cross-contamination, but I have to tell you honestly, sir, I can't tell you that it doesn't exist. That contamination does not exist because we have not had rigorous testing on a routine basis to rule it out. It's another one of those things like the.
It's a reasonable question, though, because I mean, one would consider exactly why would it be listed as in various nations as one of the contents, some of the ingredients.
It appears that much of that.
If I could shift to Dr. Biss. Dr. Biss, could you speak to the long-term impact of a child in the womb when the mother has received the vax? What have you noted in the couple of years of observation here? What's it look like? And that'll be my final question, Marjorie.
We do have literature that shows that fully intact messenger RNA crosses the breast milk. More than likely, Dr. Malone had already stated previously, we know the lipid nanoparticles go throughout the body. They don't stay in the deltoid, and they do concentrate in endocrine organs. Specifically, the ovary was the highest. I will tell you, when a female is developing in the womb, she will have all the eggs she'll ever have her whole life once that fetus is 20 weeks, halfway through the pregnancy. Unlike men who regenerate their sperm on a daily basis, a female's born with all the eggs she'll ever have, and they start to die off at birth, and usually they're all gone by 50, which is what menopause is when you run out of eggs. So we don't know what we don't know. My concern is that this is going to be a potentially multi-generational problem, which we should have learned with two drugs we've used in the past, diethylstilbestrol, or DES daughters. That was a synthetic estrogen given to pregnant women. Didn't harm the pregnant woman. However, the female offspring were shown to be at increased risk for genital cancers, primarily cervix. And we all know about thalidomide. We've never given any drug newly out of the gate ever to a pregnant woman prior to this pandemic. That would have made, no offense to Mr. Renz, malpractice attorneys salivate. This never should have been given to pregnant women because we had no long-term data on pregnant women. Last I checked, pregnancy is 9 months. This was given to pregnant women in April, starting in April of 2021, safe and effective, jab in every arm. We had no long-term data. We have spoken about the V-Safe data. If you analyze the V-Safe data correctly early on with regards to miscarriages, the rate that was quoted in the New England Journal of Medicine article was not correct. It was quoted at 13%. When you actually did the real math, the miscarriage rate was 83%.
Wow. Thank you for that frightening answer, Madam Chair. I yield.
Thank you, Dr. Biss, and I'd like to yield time to Congressman Gates.
A reasonable person watching this hearing might wonder why this is a field hearing being chaired by Congresswoman Greene rather than a hearing held by the House or the Senate with one of our standing committees. And I believe that reason is because far too many members of those committees obtain those committee seats because they are bought and paid for by Big Pharma. And if you go look at the people who lead these positions in the House and Senate and you line up the money they get from Big Pharma lobbyists and Big Pharma PACs, it is pretty easy to see why we are here. So I believe that we are just at the beginning of following up on these 60 oversight requests sent by Senator Johnson, and that is what our committees ought to be doing. They should be going line by line through the requests that Senator Johnson and others have laid out, and we should be answering those questions. And it's deeply frustrating, though I'm very grateful to Congresswoman Greene for leading this, it is indicative of how high the hill is for us to climb to get the truth out. Dr. Malone, one of my grave concerns is that all of the vaccine injured may not know that they are in the class of the vaccine injured. because people get blood clots and pulmonary embolisms, probably because of the vaccine, but also probably for other reasons as well. And Dr. Biss, when we look at these tragic consequences of pregnancy, they can at times occur in the absence of vaccine. So what advice would you give us as policymakers to try to really disaggregate the symptoms of vaccine injury and those consequences from those that may have occurred otherwise?
Thank you, Mr. Gates, for your informed question. You are correct in saying that it is an enormous challenge. Just as the virus disease itself largely overlaps with what's called the common cold now in terms of symptoms, and it's very difficult to distinguish. Likewise, these clusters of symptoms are very difficult to distinguish from background noise in some cases. That's the job of the CDC, by the way, is to provide that type of analysis objectively in a nonpartisan fashion. And as even the New York Times has acknowledged, the CDC has become a partisan political operation. So one is to look for clusters of symptoms that correlate with a known disease or toxicity, and then identify patients who have those clusters. Practicing physicians currently, even those that aren't subject to the many professional and financial disincentives to be open and transparent about these things that you're mentioning, I'm choosing my words, are subjected to an enormous amount of not only propaganda or psyops, as has the entire public been subjected to it, but also enormous numbers of disincentives to disclose adverse events and disclose what might appear to be vaccine-related problems.
I hate to interrupt you, but that should be illegal. It should be illegal if someone is engaged in the practice of medicine or in the highly regulated pharmaceutical industry for people to try to disincentivize access to the information. And it's easy for us to blame the CDC, but frankly, they in a way work for us because we're the ones that authorize the funds for the things that they do and don't do. And so, I think that one of the things we got to work on probably is legislation that directs them to those data, to those clusters, and that then disallows the corrupt activities that you seem to be highlighting.
So, Mr. Gates, I've been advised that technically it is already illegal. These physicians have signed agreements, and their healthcare systems have signed agreements that they are obligated technically to disclose vaccine-related adverse events to the VAERS system. And that disclosure is being actively, let's say gently, disincentivized. There is strong consequences being deployed in medical practices and hospitalist environments to disclosing adverse events, and yet technically it is fraud. They have signed agreements with the federal government that they will disclose these things through the VAERS system. So my understanding from attorneys that are busy practicing in this area, which is a small number, maybe 200 right now in the United States, because that's a whole nother thing, is that a strong case can be made that this does represent medical fraud in the failure to disclose these events. And I'm in touch with some federal investigators who share with me that there's a number of things here in which aspects of this response, in which federal employees and agencies have failed to comply with federal law. In many aspects, the notorious one being the revolving door, and the two FDA employees that oversaw the Moderna authorization, then immediately left to take six-figure jobs with Moderna. But there's many examples of what appears to have been fraud or law-breaking occurring within the federal administrative state that is not. These individuals are not being held accountable because there aren't the oversight structures, ombudsman, or other processes to enforce the law.
Yeah, even when we catch them. By the way, I'm holding the Inspector General report from DOD, where the Inspector General said that there was not the itemized review of people's religious exemptions that the law requires. So if we're going to keep funding it, it's going to keep happening. And I think the message to us is that we have to use the power of the purse. I don't have any other questions, but if Dr. Biss, if you had anything to contribute regarding how to kind of disaggregate these symptoms, I'd love to hear your perspective before you.
Well, I would love to give you an example that just happened to me this week that kind of shows what's happening down in the trenches with the physicians. I had a patient come see me. She's 47, healthy. Because her husband works as a civilian in a military base in Germany, she had to get to Moderna. And then when she came back to the States, she had to get a booster. She had Pfizer, so she had 3 shots in aggregate. Her last injection was in January of 2022, so it's been a while. For some reason, with no antecedent event, she didn't break a limb, she didn't have surgery, she wasn't sitting on a plane for 12 hours, she developed bilateral lower extremity blood clots, one of which broke off and caused a pulmonary embolism. She survived, but she was in the hospital for quite some time, had a huge workup. So bottom line is she has 5 specialists now on her case for all her problems. She comes to see me for her annual exam, and she's telling me this story, and I said to her, "Did you get any of these messenger RNA injections?" And she looked at me and she said, "You're the first doctor that's ever asked me that." ER physician, hematologist, rheumatologist, I don't know who else is on her case. I'm just an OBGYN. I can't help her with any of her problems. I said, well, you need to go to the hematologist, and this is what this hematologist needs to order on you, please. But this is what we're up against. They're not asking the question. So how are you gonna tabulate any of this? Nobody's connecting the dots.
Yeah, I would just finally observe, we're only aware of the vaccine injuries where essentially people are so hyper aware of the connection between these things that they almost self-identify because we have this infrastructure that disincentivizes it. And we fund this system. It is federal money that funds healthcare in this country, and we simply should not tolerate that. Thank you so much for filling this leadership vacuum. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Gates. Well, here in the shadow Congress, we do talk about the VAERS reports, and these are the numbers. And so these are the numbers of patients, doctors, clinics, hospitals that have reported to the system that we do indeed fund here in Congress. And there should be accountability, and there should be transparency. And every single one of these victims deserve their story to be heard and their cases to be investigated and asked if they have been vaccinated. So I completely agree with that. I'd like to yield time to Congressman Biggs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our panelists for being here. Just some of the notes I was taking down. And then I want to ask some questions based on the comments you made. Miscarriage rate, actual 83%. Not rigorous testing. DNA fragmentation leading to adulteration. You didn't know what was in the tube even when you got the vaccine. Localized to deltoids, but that was not true. How about recent study just released, I think, about 9 days ago, indicating some kind of palliative effects, positive effects, if you took HCQ or ivermectin. I don't know if you saw that. That was suppressed. Doctors came to me who were actually threatened with, I'm a lawyer, so we call it disbarment. I don't know what you call it, defrocking or something like that for the doctors who had dared to prescribe HCQ or ivermectin. So, as a lawyer, and part of the reason we're here, and I thank the chair for calling us together, is we want liability, accountability, and responsibility. And so I look at it and I think of a number of ways to get at that, to skin that cat. Product liability, medical liability, I think intentionality, I think of culpable mental state. I'm thinking of intentionality, knowledge. I'm thinking of recklessness, negligence, those types of things. And I'm going to go down the panel, all of you, because I want accountability. My clients want accountability. One other statement that you made: disincentivized to report adverse events. Okay, all of those things put together, none of those things are coincidental. Those are not organic. Those are those are orchestrated. They are put together. And so I'm going to start with you, Mr. Renz, because you're a lawyer, right?
I've been called that.
Yeah. Well. We've been called. Look, this is the way I don't practice anymore. I'm trying to repent. So I went to
Good
Congress.
luck.
Boy, I'll have a lot of repenting to do later. But anyway, I'd like your responses. How do we get at the liability? You mentioned transparency earlier. I'm not looking for just transparency. I'm looking for Dr. Fauci and others to have to basically own up to this stuff and deal with it, and not have government-paid bodyguards. Because anyway, I'll let you answer, Mr. Renz.
So understand that the layers of liability protection that exist right now are so profound that it's mind-blowing. Do you understand that when you got, well, I don't know if you got the shot, when someone went and got this shot, they didn't get it from Pfizer or Moderna. They got it from the DOD. The DOD distributed this. The contract with our federal government requires that to distribute this, the DOD had to ensure that there was absolute immunity. So before we could, if you want to sue someone right now, you're going to have to sue the DOD. Good luck. If you get through them by proving intentionality, which is very difficult without the data, which they continue to hide, this is why I'm encyclopedic in my knowledge of what occurred, because I've been trying to figure out how to sue these guys, and I have to get the data to prove the intentionality. I will tell you that I think there's a number of claims. I've looked at a RICO claim, which I think I could credibly make. I'll tell you that claim would cost me $5 to $8 million, my cost to litigate. I don't have $5 to $8 million. And if I didn't have $5 to $8 million, I'd risk sanctions because I'd be bringing a case that I couldn't manage. So there are mechanisms moving forward. Now, before we get to how to get around this, because, I mean, realistically, if the vaccines are safe and effective, why do they need liability shield? I mean, why do we need 50 layers of liability for something that was so safe and so effective? Why is it that we passed law after law after law way before this whole COVID thing was going down to ensure that this sort of liability protection might be in place? And I'm going to answer this because I want to bring something up that hasn't been touched on here. So we have the case in New York. I developed the case. It's against EcoHealth Alliance for the creation of SARS-CoV-2 in the Wuhan lab. That case alleges that EcoHealth Alliance worked with the CCP in the Wuhan lab and created, well, this nightmare that we've had. Let me ask you something. Does anybody in this room believe that we could transfer the technology necessary to do that sort of genetic engineering, that sort of bioweapon development? And I say bioweapon because, remember, dual-use research, under the law, bioweapon, gain of function, two sides of the same coin. Does anybody believe that we transferred that sort of technology to a CCP lab without an okay from the DOD or CIA? I got news for you. They knew exactly what was going on. We have a ton of evidence on this. I'm going to tell you further. I have right here in front of me from a report that we sent to a couple people here in Congress before the 2022 election. It got about as much response as you guys are getting. That there was a study, Dr. Malone could probably comment on this better than I can, but that study showed that there was a 12 nucleotide sequence that they found in a Moderna patent, which was a perfect reverse match to what we have in SARS-CoV-2. That patent was filed in 2016. Thanks, David Martin, for a lot of his patent research. But the thing that I want to tell you about, according to our case and the data and evidence that we've submitted, we believe that this disease was actually developed in the mid-2010s-ish. We don't have a hard date, but around there. We hope that with discovery we'll get a more specific date. Now, I want to share something else, and this is speculative, And I was very hesitant to bring this forth, but I'm going to tell you because I have to keep the individual who gave me this data anonymous to protect them. So I have, and if we can put it up, I want to show you what I've got. This is a declaration from me signing because I cannot have this whistleblower's name anywhere. I witnessed this whistleblower do this. I have a separate declaration which I will not make public. The whistleblower has brought forth to me, and I'm using whistleblower in a general term, but I have the military records, military medical records from this individual. And they were obtained through a court proceeding. I can't say any more than that, but I will tell you that I will testify under oath. I will put my hand on a Bible and put my license at risk, saying that I can confirm that I've done my due diligence on this, as I would to present this to the court. Now, it would be challenged under the rules of evidence, I'm sure, but I want to share this, and I'm only sharing this so that you, with subpoena power, can ask a question. Scroll down to the next page, please. Do you see what that says? That blacked out page, which we had to black out because of the fact that it was personally identifiable medical information and also would have put the person at risk. Do you see the date there? November 14th at Irwin ACH, Fort Riley, Kansas, COVID-19 immunization, Moderna. Five different instances. And following this page, you'll see 5 different instances where this person's medical record, you see at the very top, 2014, at Irwin ACH, Fort Riley, Kansas, COVID-19 immunization by Moderna. Now, I'm not suggesting, well, I guess I am suggesting, that maybe we should ask why it is that this soldier was apparently seen 5 times in 2014 for a COVID-19 immunization. Now, I'm not going to go out and tell you that this proves that this was built 5-10 years ago or that the timeline was entirely fraud. I'm going to tell you that we ought to look into it. And if we're going to ask questions, we ought to ask real questions. Our DOD and CIA were involved with this. To what extent? How long has this been involved? This was created in a lab in one of the greatest enemies to the United States of America. I'll let you fill in some blanks on the legal implications here. The lies, and remember also, I can't FOIA the DOD. I can't FOIA the CIA. I ain't going to get anywhere with that. You know as well as I do where that's going to go. It's a really interesting thing that the same DOD who I have these records from and who seem to be implicated in numerous other aspects of this and who are willing to take the blame and sign the contracts would have had to sign off on the technology transfers necessary to do this with communist China. I want to ask the question, what's the real history of COVID? You know, the Representative Davidson asked earlier about Operation Warp Speed. Well, maybe that timeline wasn't true. I don't know. I'm not a scientist and cannot say anything other than this is the evidence I have, and this is one small part of it. It's interesting going back over the questions that were asked. You mentioned shedding earlier. Someone asked about shedding. I can show you Pfizer documents where they talk about shedding. I can not only show you Pfizer documents where they talk about shedding, I can show you that in the Comirnaty approval, they agreed to do a study, and the study protocol was based on oncolytic gene products for gene therapy, something, shedding. Okay? They admit their study. You don't run a multi-million-dollar study unless there's a reason for it. Again, Dr. Malone and other experts can talk the value. All I can do is present you guys the evidence, and I've got an immense amount of it.
So my time has expired, I think, but I do appreciate that, and I do appreciate, Madam Chair, you holding this committee hearing. And it's a shame that we're not holding it in a committee hearing room with bringing under subpoena other individuals that should be brought in, but maybe we can do that using this as a stepping stone. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Biggs. I agree. Hopefully we do get to move this into a regular committee. I'd like to yield time to Senator Johnson.
Well, Madam Chair, I also want to thank you again for holding this. Those few members that did show up, you're not going to get a lot of accolades for doing this. It's pretty lonely in the Senate, pretty lonely in the House to be asking these questions, which I think is its own travesty. Dr. Malone, in our event about 12 months ago, December 7th, that was billed as what is in the vaccine, how does it work, how would it cause injury. I still don't think we got nailed down as much as I wanted to. It's certainly been described to me in layman's terms that you've got this lipid nanoparticle biodistributes all over the body. It injects this modified mRNA, lasts a lot longer than the body was supposed to. Now, you said something earlier that is slightly different from what I've heard. I've heard it gets injected into the cell, it juices the mitochondria to produce the energy to produce and express the spike protein, and then the body attacks the spike protein because it's a foreign body, it's toxic, and that creates inflammation. That's what myocarditis is. So that's my layman term of what happened. Can you accurately describe? Again, we don't exactly know what's in these, this gene therapy, but how does it operate, and how could it cause these injuries?
So the injuries are so widespread, and many of them can be.
Let me just add, we're hearing these turbo cancers.
Yes.
Again, if all of a sudden you're juicing the mitochondria of a cancer cell, again, as a layman, that would be concerning. So take it away.
I think you're conflating two trains of research. The activation of mitochondrial metabolism, and which is the mitochondria are these energy sources that are within our cells. You can think of them as the Tesla battery for your cells. They are impacted in some way that's not clear by the nature of the composition of the material, and that's what's observed. That as you administer the material to cells, you observe this alteration in mitochondrial function. The part that mitochondria are not directly involved in producing protein. Those are ribosomes, and functionally what happens here is that this large molecule, I call it a string of pearls, the modified messenger RNA, moves into the white part of the egg, the cytoplasm of the cell, and gets loaded onto these protein manufacturing machines that we call ribosomes. They do consume energy in order to make proteins, but it's those ribosomes that do the business. In terms of what could be causing the turbocancers, certainly the modification of metabolism, which is what you're talking about, the energy generating part of the cell, can contribute to that because cancer cells are already kind of predisposed and off the rails in terms of their regular control. However, what we have learned recently, and this is literally just recently, now there's over a dozen labs that have confirmed it, and it's been confirmed by, as I mentioned, the European Medicines Agency, Health Canada, and the FDA, is that we have these short DNA fragments. Now, science in the real world is a situation where we have constantly evolving understanding of a complex system. And in that evolving understanding, we often have situations where we find that things are caused by many phenomena, all acting at the same time. It is well established that DNA fragments will cause what's called insertional mutagenesis. They will stick themselves into the DNA of those cells that receive them. Short DNA fragments are particularly prone to this. It has been a topic of great concern by the FDA historically. They have basically parked those concerns and not done the types of studies that they would normally have done in the past for similar systems. But this type of insertion of genetic material into your chromosomes, and by the way, this, because as the doctor will, I think, concur, these particles are also shown to cross the placenta. And so there's germ cells there in the fetus. There's germ cells throughout your body, like in your bone marrow. And then there's cells that are not stem cells. I should say stem cells, not germ cells. There are stem cells throughout your body, but many cell types that aren't. If you have integration or DNA disruption of your regular cells in your body, that can lead to cancer. But if you have disruption in particularly many of these stem cell types, that is even more prone to cancers, including blood cancers, which is among the profile of tumors that we're observing that are associated with this turbo cancer. We have leukemias and lymphomas. So I think that I speculate that what we may find is that the incidence, the cancer risk here may be partially attributed to these DNA contaminations. That would be consistent with the peer-reviewed literature. And by the way, these DNA fragments may also be shown to contribute to genetic anomalies in fetus, which is one of the most prominent causes of premature abortion. Do we agree on that? So I think that this question you've asked is touching on an evolving understanding or area of investigation that should have been well known, and previously under FDA policy would have been well investigated. We call this genotoxicity and insertional mutagenesis studies that were not performed.
So I probably made a mistake concentrating on turbo. I really wanted, the harm to the lining of the arteries, what's doing neurologically. So many of the women have neurological symptoms.
So that's
the myocarditis. I mean, what's causing that?
Okay, so what I can say definitively is that every aspect of these particles has a toxicity. The modified messenger RNA is intrinsically immunosuppressive. That's why it's been modified. Okay, it's been modified to be immunosuppressive. So the mRNA has intrinsic toxicity associated with it. This is what Carrico and Weissman got the Nobel Prize for, was making it less toxic by making it anti-inflammatory or immunosuppressive. The lipidic components, the particles themselves, are intrinsically toxic. This has long been known. It is the reason why I abandoned the technology. They're highly inflammatory. They destroy cells. When you use this in experimentation, you have to carefully monitor the dose that you administer, and you basically administer up to a toxic dose in which you're still killing a large number of cells because it is membrane active. It disrupts membrane integrity. When you lose membrane integrity, cells die. Okay, so the RNA component is toxic. The formulations themselves are toxic. That's well documented. And then the payload, the thing that they are producing, the spike protein. This is, as I mentioned, one of the things that I was ridiculed for saying so long ago. But in fact, the spike protein is a toxin. That is now well established in the scientific literature, and I think there's wide consensus on that. The cardiovascular effects that you're talking about may also include a component of autoimmune disease that is elicited by the complex themselves potentially binding to other proteins. This is the immunotoxicity is one explanation that many use for the cardiotoxicity. This autoimmune problem is a known complication, for instance, of the smallpox vaccines. The DoD dealt with that for decades. But the problem with that theory is that you observe the cardiotoxicity within hours to days. So you can observe the release of enzymes that are specific for damaged heart cells starting within hours of when the injections are provided. And data suggests that it may be up to half of people that are receiving these have some degree of cardiac damage based on these enzyme releases. So There's direct toxicity, there's indirect toxicity, there is autoimmune disease, there is toxicity from the particles, there's toxicity from the proteins, there's toxicity from the mRNA. It's all a big mess.
So there is independent research looking into these things, but it's not being directed by the CDC, the FDA, and the NIH, by and large, correct?
By and large, and I've provided to Ms. Greene and her aides a library of thousands of peer-reviewed references with or without the abstract that I've requested they put into the record for this meeting, that anyone can search now, peer-reviewed, published references of thousands of papers covering these adverse events. So it's coming in from all over the world, and I've attempted to aggregate them for purposes of this committee.
So my final comment, I really do appreciate you allowing me to be part of this. Earlier on, I said there are two problems with VAERS. Complaints. Doesn't prove causality. It generally dramatically understates.
Yes.
By only 1%, 10%, we don't really know.
Yes.
It dramatically understates the number of adverse events. So again, I really can't thank you enough for holding this. Thank you for, exposing yourselves to public scrutiny and vilification, because that's basically what you're going to get. We've got to get to the bottom of this, so thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Now I'd like to yield time to Congressman Massie.
Thank you, Ms. Greene. It was hard to get an exemption in the military from the mandate. By the way, I introduced a bill to forbid the vaccine mandate in the military 3 months before they mandated it in the military. And people thought I was a conspiracy theorist. Because our president assured us that these would never be mandated. But I felt certain the first place they would do it was the military. And so I introduced this bill, and I believe Ms. Greene was an original co-sponsor of it, to keep them from mandating it before they did. And there were some whistleblowers that came to me and said, we're pushing paper up and down the ranks here, and we feel like this is going to happen. And I said, okay, well, I'll introduce a bill to try and stop it. And there were some people who wouldn't co-sponsor the bill because they said, well, what if it's approved? Once it's approved, they should be able to mandate it. I said, no, I don't care what the approval is. I don't, because of warp speed and whatnot. But the one place you could get an exemption, like they mostly had blanket denials. And this is where they got in trouble. They were supposed to apply individual scrutiny on each of the cases when somebody applied for religious exemption, for instance. But they had boilerplate to deny members of the military their exemption from the vaccine mandate. But the one thing they would give you a blanket exemption on, which looking back, we now know, is if you were pregnant and you were in the military. Now, I'm not saying that they knew that it was dangerous to pregnant women. I'm saying they were at least trying to apply a veneer of following the law. And they can't mandate something that's not been licensed. Now, there was a ruse in the licensing, and the licensing was shoved through, and two people resigned over the two people in charge of licensing resigned over being pushed to license it. I've actually interviewed them, spent hours with them. And they have told me that they were told the reason they had to expedite the approval is so the mandates could go through. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the approval happened after they were removed from the project by Peter Marks, which you've mentioned, Dr. Malone. Peter Marks removed them from their duties in approving not the EUA, but the license itself. And then he expedited the approval without an advisory committee. Now, I know a lot of these advisory committees are just rubber stamps, but they do at least give you some small comfort that somebody outside of the FDA has looked at this and everything's on the up and up. But they skipped even that process. And so the licensure happened on August 23rd, and the mandate in the military happened on August 24th. Now, it was not the same product, for legal reasons, they say. Scientifically, it was the same. We can argue about that. But the blanket exemption was for pregnant women. Now, isn't it true, Dr. Biss, that they didn't test this on pregnant women?
No, the original Pfizer trials, you were not allowed to be pregnant, and they actually had the men be sure that if they had intercourse with somebody and they got this, they had to wear a condom. So they were obviously worried about something possibly being transmitted. Now, obviously, not everybody follows the rules, and there were unintended pregnancies in women in the trials. And, you know, Naomi Wolf has been getting these dumps of the trial data they wanted to hide from us, remember, for 75 years, that shows the miscarriage rates were in the high 80th percentile in those trial participants. Now, you brought up the DOD because I have information on that. Even though somebody that was pregnant in the military was getting these, even though they supposedly got a blanket exemption, because the miscarriage rates tripled from 2020 to 2021.
In the military?
In the military.
And this, I mean, this is a place where we have data on fairly healthy people. You can't get in the military unless you're healthy. I mean, it's depending on how many people they need on any given day, psoriasis can keep you out of the military. And it does. I have kids who academically and athletically off the charts, and they have one little health issue, and they're denied acceptance into the military. And so I find this interesting that here we have a database of people who by definition are healthy, or they wouldn't be there. And we find data like that, which I was not aware of until you just brought it up. But I think it's problematic. I mean, this was effectively an off-label use, wasn't it? I mean,
well, the majority of medications we use in obstetrics are off-label use, but these are things that have been on the market for a long time, and it's considered using those now to be standard of care. An example would be, you know, terbutaline used for premature labor, you know, terbutaline's used for asthma. You know, that's just an example. This was hot off the press. I wouldn't consider this an off-label use. We were forced to provide this to our patients, and we also were told to not give exemptions to pregnant women.
and what I find ironic or hypocritical, saying that nothing crossed the barrier between the mother and the child, either in the womb or through the breast milk, but then they were claiming that you should get vaccinated because your child would be born with immunity. So how can those two things be simultaneously?
So that's the shtick with every vaccine they tell us to give a pregnant woman. You want to give the pregnant woman the vaccine so she'll make antibodies that will cross the baby, the placenta into the baby. But are vaccinated antibodies better than what the baby would make on the baby's own? We don't know. That's the shtick with the new RSV vaccine, which is not messenger RNA based, but there was not very good things found in those trials either. Babies died, and yet this has been approved. And, you know, our governing body wants us to give this to pregnant women.
So, I mean, all along, this should have been a risk versus benefit decision.
Can I address that?
Yes,
because I
please.
have. So women were told in the year of the pandemic that they were going to be at higher risk for dying if they're pregnant because they're immunocompromised. Beth Pinellas did a great study. She's a high-risk obstetrician in the Houston area. She studied a huge cohort of patients that were admitted from April of 2021 to the following April to the hospital, pregnant and non-pregnant with COVID. With statistical significance, she demonstrated that if you were not pregnant and sick with COVID, you were more likely to die. I believe pregnant women are not immunocompromised. I don't have a lot of sick people in my pregnant practice. I think there's something protective in a pregnant woman. But they were told if we would have had that data, maybe they could have used that for some decision making. They were told they were going to have premature labor if they got sick with COVID, and studies came out showing there was no difference in the preterm labor rates. They were told their babies were going to die if they were born to somebody with COVID and got COVID. I will tell you, you didn't say in introducing my CV, but you know, I've been chief of staff of a 400-bed level 2 trauma center, high-risk obstetric hospital. If we had a huge amount of maternal death in 2020, I would have been aware of that. We probably had 10,000 deliveries up to this point at my obstetric unit. I had nurses run analytics. We've had 2 maternal deaths since 2020, and neither was related to COVID. In my private practice, we are small. We don't have a lot of deliveries. We had 900 deliveries 2020, 2021, 2022. We had no deaths. The only person that ended up on a ventilator with COVID was actually in 2021 in that summer. She probably had Delta. She was not vaccinated. And let me tell you, every specialist that rounded on her, the first sentence in her chart was so-and-so age, black female, unvaccinated. Like making the patient look bad because they weren't vaccinated. She was 32 weeks pregnant. I did a C-section in order to help her to be able to breathe. It didn't work. 8 hours later, she ended up being placed on a ventilator, got the remdesivir. Fortunately, she survived. But she's the only one in her practice that ended up that way. We didn't have any maternal mortality. There's not a lot of infant mortality I'm aware of. But you know what's on the rise now? Maternal mortality and infant mortality in our country.
So back to thank you for explaining that. I mean, you have real world data with a large data set there. It's a risk versus benefit. And the thing I think they missed the whole time is they denied natural immunity. So there's studies that show each time you get the vaccine that it's a cumulative risk. The risk increases, particularly between the first dose and the second dose. But it seems to be a trend that holds true through the third, fourth, fifth doses, that the more doses you have, the higher risk, that it's a cumulative thing. Well, if you're going to evaluate risk versus benefit, and you ignore the fact that somebody has already effectively had nature's dose, the first dose, if they got COVID before, and they're trying to decide whether to get the vaccine, wasn't it irresponsible to ignore whether somebody had already had COVID or not when deciding whether the risk or the benefit outweighed the risk for that person to take the vaccine?
That's an easy one. Yes.
I mean, just as an example, when we found out, when it was clear there was a signal that myocarditis and pericarditis could result from the vaccine, it did result. They rushed out to say, but you can also get that from COVID as well. And so therefore, everybody needs to get vaccinated. Isn't the problem with that, Dr. Malone, that if you've already had COVID and you've passed through that risk window where COVID may have been able to give you myocarditis, why would you submit yourself to another roll of the dice?
The New York State Supreme Court has made a determination that these products are not effective in preventing infection or spread of the virus. The data are abundant globally that what you're calling natural immunity, the complex multifactorial immune response against multiple antigens, both cellular, humoral, and innate, produced by this infection process and recovery, which, by the way, is associated with much lower levels of spike protein for shorter periods of time than are produced by these mRNA products. Okay, that immunity is clearly superior. That has been well established. What in this list of falsehoods that you've just recounted, I refer back to testimony that was given to Congress, sworn testimony by Deborah Birx, when asked specifically why the government did not disclose the lack of effectiveness of these products. She said, "We hoped they would work." That's what we've seen all the way through, and we're continuing to see in the stonewalling by the FDA concerning the DNA contamination, is the triumph of hope over data. And there's a more fun. I'm sorry we've lost our lawyer. In my opinion, one of the key things underpinning all of this is basically the legal precedent of the Chevron deference, which is essentially that the courts defer to the regulatory authority as being the ultimate authority. So we're in a situation where these individuals, Peter Marks being one of them, Peter Marks, an oncologist, not a trained vaccinologist, not an immunologist, not a virologist, is in a position to assert whatever truth he wishes, and the courts will defer to that. Mr. Renz can have a bevy of folks like myself say otherwise, but the courts will defer to the position that's taken by the administrator. And that creates a firewall. They can basically do or say whatever they want, and that's what they have been doing all the way through. They have been substituting hope or propaganda or executive branch requirements for actual data. And that's why we get all of these paradoxes that we're calling lies. Whatever word we want to use around that, whatever euphemism we want to use to make it nice, that's the situation we're in, is that these administrators are immune from your oversight, clearly we've seen that, are immune from judicial oversight, and respond to executive branch directives. Remember that Mr. Marks created the term warp speed. Mr. Marks is intrinsically linked to Operation Warp Speed. It's his creature. He has defended it. He has done what's necessary in order to enable it. Okay? He's not an objective, independent arbiter of truth. And that's the fundamental. Earlier, I mean, I could go on and on about what needs to be fixed at the FDA, and have in a recent Epoch Times interview. But I'm being asked by many people. As noted in a recent report, I am considered to be a far-right conservative, and so those of that ilk have been approaching me about what could be done about this in the next administration. There's a lot of things, but we have to start by creating these branches of government must be functioning as neutral arbiters of truth, not as politicized advocacy organizations for a particular agenda. And that's what we have had all the way through this.
You know, if Chevron deference didn't exist as a legal construct, our colleagues would invent it here in Congress. They have deferred. Like, the reason we're having this hearing here,
preaching to the choir,
is that the Committee of Jurisdiction says that Marjorie and I should leave it up to the experts, and that as elected people, as the only people that you get to choose in Washington, D.C., that we should put our brains in neutral and defer to the people over at FDA. And they are not the scientists, the level just above them, which are almost always political scientists. And we refused to ignore common sense, and we got censored by our own government.
I write extensively about the public policy implications of this, and the intrinsic meaning of West Virginia versus EPA, and the need. One can only hope that the judiciary takes back some of its power, and I hope and advocate that the legislative branch, which is supposed to be a co-equal branch of government, takes back its power and is somehow able to overcome the position that seems to be rampant in the senior executive service, that y'all are just temporary employees and they're the ones that actually run the government.
Well, those who would imagine that the bureaucrats can run the world and that you don't need elected officials actually ran off the experts out of the FDA. You mentioned that we had decades of experience, that if we had followed it in terms of reviewing vaccines, that we would have caught some of these things. And, you know, and I'll use my own words, millions of people could have been saved from harm. Two of those individuals, and this should have been the ultimate sign to anybody on the outside, when Marion Gruber and Philip Krause, who work for Peter Marks, were basically run off, okay? They left in this fall of 2021.
Remember it well.
Right in the triggering event, and I've talked to both of them, is when they were forced to approve something using methods that were political in nature, reasoning that was political in nature instead of scientific in nature, when they were told to defy the standards that they had followed for 3 decades, each of them have roughly 3 decades of experience. And they are not vaccine hesitant, okay? They are the ones who approve these things. They are true believers in the good that can come from
basically my peers and colleagues. I'm now accused of being an anti-vaxxer vaccine developer.
Yeah. So, and the other reason they left, by the way, which wasn't highlighted enough, is they weren't, remember when the BLA, the actual license for the vaccines was getting approved, simultaneously an EUA was coming out for the boosters. And they had the audacity to say maybe not everybody needs a booster if they've already had 2 of these shots. And that, in fact, telling people they need a booster 5 to 8 months after they've already taken the vaccine is probably counterproductive to arguing that the vaccine is efficacious.
Mr. Massie, if I might interrupt
Please.
on that
We
and amplify
invited
on
you
it.
here for that.
The reason why the unspoken truth behind that advocacy for frequent boosters was that these products are associated with what's called negative effectiveness. At some period of time after administration, typically in the range of 2 to 6 months, pardon me.
You need a booster.
At some period of time, if you have accepted the products, you become more likely to develop disease or death compared to natural immune or otherwise unvaccinated individuals. We're all basically infected and recovered now. And so what's been shown is that you get basically a short-term bump in your protection after administration that rapidly deteriorates and drives you into this negative effectiveness range. And I've testified, sworn testimony in Texas Senate, et cetera, about the mechanisms by which that happens. This was all foretold. Well developed in the scientific literature, these processes of immune imprinting and original antigenic sin. But that's why they wanted to boost and boost and boost, is because they were facing the problem that the vaccinated and the highly vaccinated were going to become the predominant components of the hospitalized and dead. And in fact, despite these policies, that has become the case worldwide. So that's what put them in that box. They never acknowledged it. Another illustration of your point is Dr. Paul Offit, who, if there is a vaccine advocate other than Peter Hotez, that would be Dr. Offit, has now come to express strong reservations about these policies having to do with the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, and he is now no longer being invited to the oversight committees. So we got a problem. Enough said.
Thank you very much. I'll yield back to Ms. Greene.
Please do.
We actually did have data showing that these shots were failing. I presented a slide to my medical council in July of 2021 from the Israeli Ministry of Health. Israel, as you know, started receiving their injections sooner than we did. So by July of that year, they were on their booster, so their 3rd injection. And they were already showing that their hospitals were filling up with sick COVID patients in the ICUs. So we had that information 2 months before the months you're talking about.
I think there was also an event in Barnstable County, Massachusetts, I may be pronouncing that wrong, where almost everybody who was at an event got COVID, and almost all of them were vaccinated. It was a real eye-opener that was pretty much ignored, and they just plowed through the approval, and we saw our trusted officials go on TV and say, it'll stop the spread. And by the way, that was also the whole premise for the mandates, wasn't it? That you were responsible not for yourself, but for your neighbor, and that if you got vaccinated, you wouldn't give it to your neighbor or your grandmother.
So recent Freedom of Information Act disclosures, we're having to drag all this data out, including, for instance, the data on the myocarditis and pericarditis, which we now have records showing back in early 2021 that this incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis was well known to the government and was intentionally hidden by Rochelle Walensky and the executive branch. We also have data that relates to these phenomena that you're just talking about, which show that the government was well aware of these problems and, again, actively hid that information, withheld it from the public for reasons that are difficult to discern other than political. There is a repeated pattern of withholding information by this administration in particular concerning risks, adverse events, and lack of effectiveness for reasons that are difficult to understand other than it involving politics and embarrassment.
Go ahead, Mr. Renz.
So interestingly enough, probably 75% of the questions that we've had today throughout this, I've presented evidence to courts on, including this. Okay. Going back to the VRBPAC FDA document that I mentioned from October of 2020, that document listed Guillain-Barré, encephalomyelitis. This is why I couldn't be a doctor. I have to say, transverse myelitis, stroke, convulsions, anaphylaxis, thrombocytopenia. All of these things that you're hearing about were listed not as side effects, but serious adverse events of special interest. Now, let me explain to you why that is. These were things that they were watching for and expected. In fact, if you go to the Pfizer documents, you see they were tracking this. But if they'd put it as a side effect, if they'd listed this as a side effect, well, that'd have to go on the disclosures, right? You can't give it for, you got to have it. You know. So what they did was they said, well, these are adverse events, but we're not sure that they're going to happen. But they seem worth studying, right? So you have a new disease, or I'm sorry, a new vaccine coming out, a new product with, you know, was it 5 minutes of testing or did they develop in the mid-2010s? We don't really know. But what we do know is they had an expectation that these things would occur. And yet, instead of informing people, they miscategorize it and say, well, you know, we kind of expect they're going to occur, but we don't really want to disclose it, so we're going to not call it a side effect. This is, again, evidence of cover-up, evidence of fraud. This was the greatest fraud in American history, if not the history of the world. They knew. If we had 4 hours for me to present data, I still couldn't finish with all the evidence that I could show you indicating that they knew, covered up, lied, misled, while children, women, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters were dying. I know, because during a lot of this fight, when we started, when we started this fight, there were no other lawyers. I remember in the summer of 2020, as someone who I had no experience. I was the wrong man for this job. I see what's happening, and I'm looking. And I was working on a master's in health science at the time. That's why I started studying the epidemiology of COVID. I can't do it like these guys, but I understand it, right? So I'm studying this, and I'm seeing that they're lying. So I call up other lawyers. Hey, do you want to help me fight this? No, you're nuts. They're not lying. The fear tactics that were used were designed to disincentivize it. The pressures, the political pressure. In Ohio, we had an immense amount of political pressure on anybody that was speaking out. Just mind-blowing. This was something that was known, it was orchestrated, it was planned. There is all sorts of evidence. And you know what? I haven't even told you what I got on Hunter Biden's connection to this, which I do have documents. This was a known 10% for the big guy. This was known. There is no question in my mind, and I don't think that if we went before a jury, there'd be any question. but for the fact that we can't get in front of the jury on a lot of these things because of immunity or because of nonsense. And I cannot possibly agree more with the discussion on Chevron deference. The single greatest threat to our democracy is the administrative state. Throughout the 20th century, I've studied the history of this legally. The evolution of the law related to the administrative state, there is no separation of powers in the administrative state. They are judge, jury, executioner, lawmaker, and everything else. They don't care about your oversight, but we keep funding them. They keep growing. We keep creating new agencies where Congress can put off hard questions to other people that they don't want to answer themselves because it's politically unpopular.
Well, not all of us are funding them.
Well, there are a handful of wonderful elected officials who I'm honored to stand with, but it's unfortunately far too many that haven't sold their souls to Big Pharma and to other lobbyists. And I'm ashamed to say that this is the first time in my life, second time. I used to come to D.C. with reverence. I used to admire my nation's capital. I come to D.C. for the last few years, and I look and I think it's a filthy swamp. And you know, it's a shame because the few honorable people still here, we the people have gotten so sick of this. Yeah. It's so apparent to anybody. We're having hearings about things that everybody knows are true. Everybody knows these aren't safe. Everybody knows they aren't effective. Yes, Pfizer admitted it before the EU. They don't stop transmission. We didn't even bother studying it. Fraud, anybody? How about the mRNA? My friend State Rep Holly Jones sponsored the mRNA and food bill that we had. All it did was require informed consent. Require that if you were going to put a gene therapy into an animal that may or may not transmit, that people be given that knowledge. Because there's a loophole in the Organic Food Act that will allow organic foods to be given this, and no one knows.
Mr. Renz, we'll actually be covering that in another hearing, and I know Congressman Massie shared that video. So no, it's extremely important. We'll be doing many more hearings on this. I think it's important, and I can assure you, you're looking at two members of Congress that share your exact same frustrations.
I'm honored to stand before we got, I think 5, 10 people that are, hey, we'll win it with 5 or 10 if we have to, whatever we got to do for freedom.
Thank you. I do have some questions for you. You were sharing some information. Were you referring to the Defense Medical, there it is, DMED.
Yes.
The database. Okay. And that is controlled by the Department of Defense. And I found it very interesting. You had spoken at Senator Johnson's roundtable before, and it was you had revealed that below were various diseases. Hypertension had a 2,181% increase. Diseases of the nervous system, 1,048% increases. Malignant neoplasms of esophagus, 894% increase. Multiple sclerosis, 680% increase. Malignant neoplasms of digestive organs, 624% increase. Guillain-Barré syndrome, 551% increase, and it goes on and on and on, even down into migraines, ovarian dysfunction, ironically, 437% increase, and carrying on. Were all of these diagnoses in military members?
Yeah, so the DMAT data is essentially, the way that database works is if you're a soldier, you go to the VA, right? Or I'm sorry, you go to the Defense Medical Department. I mean, you go to where you're on-site guy. So they have very complete records, right? So they've got everything. It's a premier database, and they use it for signals, right? If they want to watch the health of our soldiers, is there something coming out here, something coming out there? They use it signals to see.
But Mr. Renz, these are healthy soldiers.
Very healthy.
As
very
Congressman
healthy.
Massie pointed out, you have to be of great health, very good health to join the military. And if we were seeing increases like this, is this database open to the public?
No, it's not accessible to the public. And in fact, once we recorded, let me tell you what, we actually have video. I had 2 witnesses go in a room and video them taking this data off of the DMED database. This data is as verified as it could be. Now, was it accurate? Well, the DOD hasn't responded under oath. All they said was there's a glitch to a reporter. The fact checkers took it from there. Now, here's the thing. The most incredible aspect of this is when they said that there was an error, they didn't say that the error was with the new data. They said that it was wrong for 5 years, and then the new data was actually correct. So somehow after 5 years of error, even though they didn't know that there was an error, this database magically corrected itself.
Right. How does
Right?
that happen when people are complaining about vaccine side effects, perhaps?
Seems to be. But here's the thing about this data. If there's an error, how about some transparency? See, the real problem here is that there's never anything truthful from these people. So was there an error? Could there have been an error? I have no way of knowing. It's on them to show us. We allege, think about this, Congresswoman, I literally stood before a sitting senator, presented evidence that was verifiable. I submitted that evidence to court. I lose my license if I lie to the court. I put this evidence out there that our soldiers are being killed by their own leaders. And they don't respond? They didn't respond to this? And by the way, were the numbers perfect? I have no idea. What I do know is, we talked about cancers. Well, guess what? We were just talking about turbo cancers. We talked about reproductive issues. Guess what? We have an expert talking about reproductive issues. We talked about all these things, the neurological issues, all these different things. These things, they were, whether the numbers are perfect or not, I don't care. They were certainly signals. They were certainly things that should have been investigated.
And this comes from a whistleblower, correct?
It comes from 4 whistleblowers.
4 whistleblowers.
All military, all separate, all pulled the numbers from different spots with different access.
Wow. Dr. Malone, our great men and women serving in the military have to pass rigorous physical exams. They are constantly tested. They are among the healthiest people in our population. In your opinion, is there any reason for any of our military members to have to receive a COVID-19 vaccine?
No.
And if they are reporting all of this unbelievable increases in terrible side effects from the COVID vaccines, what does that do to our enlisted men and women? Does that make them capable of fighting in wars? Are they healthier after receiving these COVID vaccines?
I've been in touch with members of JAGs in the Navy at captain level that are involved in these cases, and I have heard many reports. Ms. Greene, let me give you an example of what I hear on the street about the kind of thing that's going on in DOD. The way it works is that death benefits cannot be distributed until an autopsy report has been concluded for a military member that's died while serving. And what I've heard repeatedly is those autopsy reports are being withheld in, for instance, Navy SEALs and other high-performance athletes that have passed away suddenly, unexpectedly, which means that their survivors cannot get those death benefits. But apparently the appearance is that those autopsy reports are being withheld because they contain information that is inconsistent with what the brass at DOD wishes to have put forward. In the case of what Mr. Renz is describing, the DMED database, this is administered by a private independent contractor here in the Beltway area, as I understand it. And what apparently transpired is that when Mr. Renz and his whistleblower colleagues brought this data forward, there was a sudden flurry of reconsideration of those data, and the data for, as he mentions, from the prior year's adverse events were brought up so that the differential between current and prior was minimized. But as you're pointing out, Ms. Greene, what this would indicate is that our armed forces are not well if they're having that level and have been having that level of baseline sickness for years and years and years. There is certainly the appearance of fraud and the appearance of data manipulation going on here, and a unwillingness and stonewalling to allow oversight and investigation to determine what actually transpired here. And there does appear to be a third-party contractor who has been managing these data and has been responsive to the interests of their government managers.
Or government contracts. Dr. Malone, if what we're looking at seems to be exactly what it is, and I think it is, it seems to be our military men and women have been used as basically lab rats or test dummies, possibly, for these vaccines. Could that be the case?
So, Ms. Greene, I have another theory of the case. And it's consistent with the recent disclosures that we've heard about some of the activities going on at the FBI, in which FBI investigations have become highly politicized and targeting conservatives. Mm-hmm. Okay? An alternative theory of the case is that what we've had is the imposition of a series of measures, such as the denial of religious accommodation that's been widespread, which has functionally acted to exclude one segment of society based on their political inclinations from serving in the military. And by the way, that same strategy appears to have been deployed throughout our medical schools. So we now have 3 or 4 classes of medical schools in which those that are not willing to comply with these mandates are not allowed to proceed. And in our let's say, high-status universities. All the Ivy League schools, until very recently, and most of them still, are demanding jabs. And those that don't comply are excluded. Mm-hmm. I hear from parents again and again and again, where can I, my conservative parents, where can I send my child? And it's Liberty or Hillsdale. There aren't a whole lot of options, and these are high-performing individuals, straight arrows, done everything by the book. They can't get into the major universities because they are not willing to be subjected to these products for religious accommodation reasons or because of health concerns. And so what we've functionally done is implemented, whether intentionally or not. I can't opine on people's intentions. I don't read brains, but functionally, there has been a swath of time in which we have excluded people from armed services and other service, and have excluded them from universities, medical schools, medical training, etc., on the basis of whether or not they're willing to accept a product that is neither safe nor effective and it remains experimental. And that's abundantly true, particularly with the current, quote, boosters, for which we have absolutely no evidence that they are effective against the current circulating dominant variant, HV.1. And even prior, the evidence was marginal. It was hidden from us, the mouse serum studies about cross-neutralization for a product designed against the Kraken variant, which was already extinguished at the time that these boosters, quote-unquote, were rolled out. They were displaced by Eris. So we've got a situation in which we clearly have products that are not safe. You know, what this mantra of safe and effective is propaganda.
That's right.
It is. It's
I
pure
think
propaganda.
What you're talking about, though, in my opinion, what we're seeing widely across America is violations of the First Amendment. And that's happening in the military. I also talk to parents and also individuals themselves that are in nursing school or in residency. And if they refuse the booster or refuse the vaccine, they're not able to continue. And they're looking for ways to find exemptions so they can continue their studies. Many of these are women in nursing school, and now we're talking about what it can do to them in their future as far as fertility and having children or carrying safe pregnancies. But I believe what we are seeing from this regime, is what I call it, is an absolute violation of the First Amendment across the board.
Well, more than just the First Amendment, what you're seeing is weaponized medicine for a political objective.
I think so too. I have a question for you, Dr. Malone. In your research and studies for mRNA vaccines, I'm sure you studied on animals and so forth, or they were tested on animals. Were the same side effects seen years ago in these tests and studies when it was being developed? Are those same side effects the same side effects we're seeing in people today?
The reason why I dropped this, and I used to work for the California Regional Primate Research Center as well as doing a lot of murine research, mouse research. I say, if mice are at the pearly gates, I'm never getting in. But we abandoned the technology in my laboratory because these products are highly inflammatory. And we tested and developed, and I have multiple other patents other than the ones that we talk about, the 9 RNA ones, on other cationic lipids and formulations. And those, we could never overcome the toxicity in vivo, nor could Gilead, that it invested far more than we did in trying to develop and advance this technology. Now, the caveat is that largely the group of Peter Cullis at University of British Columbia made some fundamental advances in the nature of the structure of these chemicals and their formulations. Credit to Peter and his colleagues. And asserted that this had addressed a lot of these toxicity problems and resulted in products that would have the behavior we talked about, Mr. Massie, of injection of the deltoid and targeting just to the draining lymph nodes. Clearly, those, to the extent that there were data, those data were not predictive of humans. So the answer to your question is, in my experience, we could never overcome the toxicity. The toxicity was profound. It involved direct cellular damage and incredible inflammation associated with that. We don't see that degree of inflammation, acute inflammation, with these products. So it does appear that Cullis et al., together with the pseudouridine or modified pseudouridine, did find a way to suppress that adverse event. And now that's revealed all these other toxicities that we hadn't encountered before, because basically it was killing off the animals in short order because of that toxicity. Have I answered your questions?
Yes. What I'm
It
understanding,
was absolutely known that these are toxic. These are toxic products.
and they should have never been developed.
I abandoned the technology in the 90s because I thought that it was a dead end and we could never overcome the toxicity.
Why would they continue?
There was so this gets to something that Mr. Renz was saying. The CIA absolutely has its fingers all over this. And the CIA so the logic appears to be that there's an absolute need for a rapid response capability to mitigate the risk of the bad guys developing new pathogens and deploying them, and the risk of emerging infectious disease from environmental disruption, the climate, whatever the excuse is, okay? Right. So the logic is just like akin to the logic that we have 3.4% mortality and therefore we have to do this all in a rush, right? When in fact the data show that it was about 0.025% case fatality rate across the board, a total lie. But in this case, the logic, as someone who's worked intimately with the military biodefense industrial complex in this space of vaccines and biodefense, there is a logic that we have a compelling unmet need to protect the public from emerging infectious disease and engineered pathogens, and that's going to require the ability. Let me give you, Ms. Greene, a fact. It's currently projected that we will have vaccines for all biowarfare agents deployed up until the end of World War II by 2050. In other words, a full century, okay? That's how long it takes to develop vaccines. That's high risk, okay? So in the face of that, there's the belief that we have to have something better. And I think we can all agree on that. There is a need to have some way to protect the public from emerging infectious disease and engineered bioweapons, right?
Yes.
And so the thesis was that this technology would do the trick, whereas monoclonal antibodies have failed and largely adenovirus vectored vaccines have failed. And so it appears that in the enthusiasm of the moment, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, as opposed to asserting that this is a global depopulation weapon specifically designed for that purpose, which is another theory. But let's give the DOD and Biodefense
Since
the
they
benefit
do
of the
talk
doubt,
about that.
that there was this need. Okay, and this is what the Nobel was given for: is that this was enabling for this rapid response. But in fact, what was really enabling is they threw the rule book in the trash can. Okay, the part of all of this discovery, the Soviets, faux pas, the Russians were able to field a vaccine in a very similar timeline, more traditional technology, by also throwing out the rules. So what really enabled this was circumventing the normal processes that FDA has for vaccine development. It wasn't the RNA platform itself, but that's how it's been sold to us. Okay, so that's the logic as I understand it. The story that we've all been told about this is yet more propaganda. It's another approved narrative that's been reinforced through every channel, including through the Karolinska. But upon scrutiny, it doesn't withhold, it doesn't stand up to examination. What happened here was they bypassed all of the established FDA rules and guidance for this type of technology in this rush to push some product out under the thesis that 3.4% of every 100, 3.4 of every 100 people were going to be dead on the street, which was a lie. That's how we got here. Have I answered your question?
You have.
I feel a little passionate about this.
No, and the problem with that is those safeguards were in place. Those decades of experience that they basically put a penny in the fuse box. They just shorted all that. But downstream of that, we've got the courts and stuff were set up to give immunity to the pharmaceutical companies or the government.
And the only way you can break that is if there is clear evidence of fraud. That's my understanding. I'm not an attorney now. I'm crossing over into his space, but that's what I'm told. And so that's the importance potentially of this issue of DNA contamination, because it appears to third parties to meet the criteria for evidence of fraud.
That they may have known about the DNA contamination.
And they absolutely did know. They absolutely did know about the existence of SV40 sequences, not the whole virus, in the presence of this. It appears that what happened was they had a manufacturing process, process one, in which they produced the DNA using PCR that would not require use of bacteria and this bacterial plasmid technology, the circles. Okay, and they've discovered near the end of the clinical trials, so they did most of the clinical trials based on process one, and they discovered near the end of the clinical trials they could not make enough stuff. They couldn't make the RNA, and so they had to suddenly switch. And it appears that what they did is they took research-grade material off the shelf and repurposed it for this new manufacturing process, which was not the one used in the clinical trials. And and they rushed all this through, and they didn't take the time to engineer the manufacturing process so they could extract the residual DNA to give them a pure RNA product. And there was, as was mentioned by Senator Johnson, the appearance of willful blindness.
So just to close the loop on that, and I know we've brought it up before, probably in a different context, what is the harm of having the extra DNA in there? And did they know about the potential harm?
Okay, so this was part of, I hope that the Congresswoman will grant that my testimony, which I've not been able to give to you because we've been busy talking about things, will be entered into the record. But this is something that I address explicitly. Historically,
the related technology of DNA vaccination, which I also played a key role in, which preceded this RNA vaccination, has been under intense scrutiny through its entire life cycle as a technology. It's now essentially failed, okay? But FDA required very rigorous assessment of the risks of DNA integration. What that means is a fragment of DNA goes into your genome, and when it does so, it disrupts existing genes, and it can also, if it has highly active regulatory sequences, it can turn genes on around in the area or turn them off around in the area where it integrates and where it goes into your DNA. So this is the essence of genotoxicity, damage to your chromosomes, whether they occur in your regular body cells like skin cells or muscle cells, or they occur in stem cells like is in your bone marrow, or they occur in fetal cells in the developing fetus, okay? So integration is genotoxicity. It damages your DNA. And DNA, foreign DNA delivered into cells can cause this. The FDA, let me cite their specific response in responding to questions from press on this risk. The claim that the FDA is required to take off any of the authorized or approved mRNA COVID-19 vaccines off the market is false. With over 1 billion doses of the mRNA vaccines administered, no safety concerns related to the sequence of or amount of residual DNA have been identified. With regard to the FDA-approved mRNA vaccines, available scientific evidence supports the conclusion that they're safe and effective. That's the official FDA position, okay?
Could it be possible the FDA thought that and they were being misled by the manufacturer?
The rules are that you don't draw a conclusion without data, okay? And normally, historically, one has to perform rigorous genotoxicity and insertional immunogenesis assays. We now have the most highly effective, highly active non-viral delivery system in the history of man. And we now know that that's delivering not just RNA, but also DNA fragments. DNA fragments are more recombinogenic than circular DNA, which is what's used in the DNA vaccines, okay? So more risk, higher active material, and yet the FDA did not require, because this is the tension, okay? The way it works with pharma is, because of U.S. law, it's different in the European Medicines Agency, but the law that you guys have put in place is basically says that the FDA cannot tell pharma what it has to do. Pharma has to propose what it's going to do to demonstrate safety, effectiveness, purity, potency, blah, 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 okay? And then the FDA can concur or disagree. And if they disagree, they can hold up further development until pharma comes up with a better plan. That's how the game is played here in the States, okay? And so FDA historically has drafted these guidelines that pharma can choose to follow or not, but if they don't follow them, then it's going to be harder to get the thing through. They're going to have to say, why not? Okay? So normally, they require genotoxicity and integration tests for this type of technology, and always have in the past. In this case, they basically just ignored that, okay? So normally there's this tension between the regulator and the pharmaceutical industry in which you approximate something that protects the interests of the public through this tension, right? But here, in this case, what you had was in the Pfizer documents that have been revealed, and Naomi Wolf has analyzed, they can find evidence of Pfizer saying, well, we think we're not going to do those studies. And the FDA is basically saying, okay, not a problem, functionally, okay? So the FDA does not have the data to support this claim that they're making, okay? And normally, if I was the sponsor, the developer, and I made this claim, FDA would hammer me for false advertising, okay? But here the FDA is making this with absolutely no data to support it. Now, here's the kicker, okay? Moderna has a patent on the use of RNA for vaccines. It happens to be patent number 2019-024-0317A1. And in that, Moderna explicitly acknowledges that, that RNA is superior to DNA for vaccine purposes because problems including the possibility of insertional mutagenesis, which could lead to the activation of oncogenes or the inhibition of tumor suppressor genes. Okay, so FDA says they're not aware of any concerns, but Moderna in its own patent lays out exactly the same concerns that exist about DNA and insertional mutagenesis and genotoxicity. Okay, so Moderna knows it.
Was the DNA a contaminant?
It is a contaminant. It is left in because the way they make it in process 2 is they purify circular DNA from bacteria. They make the RNA, RNA makes DNA, I'm sorry, DNA makes RNA, RNA makes protein. Okay, so they use DNA to make the RNA, and then they degrade the DNA, and then they have to purify the degraded DNA away from the RNA. And the process that they're using is apparently not very good. And so they still, and this was just revealed. It was just detected because some scientists, both in the US and in Canada, managed to get their hands on some unopened vials with clear chain of custody, sample those vials, and these are people who their business is to do deep sequencing on samples and rebuild information about whatever DNA they find on that. So they were just doing the technology that they know how to do in their business, that they're experts in, and they found, lo and behold, that there were these large numbers of DNA fragments in this RNA preparation, and they could apply standard tools that they have to reconstruct what those circular plasmid DNAs look like. Okay? None of this was disclosed to the public. And it appears that the documentation is that there are certain sequences present that are normally not allowed in anything that's going to go into humans, not the least of which is an antibiotic resistance gene. Okay? So this is going, these are going into our bodies, including an antibiotic resistance gene for kanamycin or neomycin. Normally, you're not allowed to do that if it's a DNA engineered for human use, okay? And they include these sequences from simian virus 40, not the whole virus, but highly active promoter sequences, which is exactly the thing that the FDA in their older regulations said must be avoided because it confers even more risk for insertional mutagenesis. And what appears is that Pfizer, when they provided these documents to the FDA and to the EMA and to Health Canada, they took these standard plasmid maps that are generated through programs that we all have access to, and they deleted the little notation that said there's SV40 sequences in there. And the FDA, apparently, out of, I can only think, incompetence, didn't take the raw DNA sequences, reconstruct those plasmid maps, and look at them themselves. They just took for granted what Pfizer had given them. And now this has all come out because of these researchers that did functionally something akin to the lot release testing that is not happening.
So there was probably somebody at Pfizer who knew what they were doing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And Moderna.
And then what are the specific downstream diseases or bad outcomes that come from having these?
Anything that is associated with DNA damage.
For instance, cancer?
Birth defects and cancer being the notable ones.
Okay. Very disturbing.
It is. It is shocking to me that we have communication from the FDA that is stonewalling. They're asserting there's nothing to worry about here, and yet we have in Moderna's own patents the acknowledgement of something that those of us that have been in the field for 30 years, like I have known as a fundamental property of these types of DNA fragments. It's,
Well,
me,
to
it's-
admit they know about it would be assuming liability, right, Mr. Renz? I would think if they admit that they knew and then the government mandated vaccines on the population, telling them that they're going to lose their job if they don't take the vaccine, they get kicked out of the military, they can't go to college, they can't go to school, they can't fly airplanes, they can't go to work, they can't feed their families. If they admit to knowing all
But
the
Ms.
things
Greene,
that these causes.
they have now admitted. So what happened was that the press approached these regulatory agencies and said, here's the data. The data are so overwhelming that what they came back with remarkably fast, as opposed to the kind of stuff that you guys get. They came back with responses to Trial Site News and Epoch Times almost within days, acknowledging that these contaminations are occurring. And now all we're left with is arguing about whether or not those contamination levels are acceptable or not, but they have no data to define what's an acceptable level. And so now we're arguing about whether or not it's contamination or adulteration. And if it's adulteration, it crosses the Rubicon in terms of the Code of Federal Regulations. This is what you guys built the FDA to do, is to prevent adulteration.
Well, we have a problem here in Washington. A lot of our colleagues get donations from Big Pharma, and they also vote and make the budget that funds the FDA. So we got a little problem in Washington. Mr. Renz?
With due respect to your colleagues, they're going to have to decide whether the health and safety of the American people is more important than the paychecks that they're getting from Big Pharma and the paid lobbyists. This is one of the most egregious and outrageous things I've ever seen. And I don't give the same benefit of the doubt that Dr. Malone gives. I think that this is stuff that people are well aware of. I think they were aware all the way through. There's a revolving door between the FDA and Big Pharma. You just shut your mouth so you can go get your paycheck from Big Pharma after you leave, or vice versa. This is absolutely the reason that we had the Nuremberg Code, informed consent, preventing medical experimentation. You know, they've admitted you have different cap colors to designate different lots that have different dosages in these vaccines. Why are they putting different dosages? If they know what they're doing, why do they got to tinker with it? They didn't know what they were doing. They were experimenting. This is the largest experiment on the human population in history, and it was entirely done without informed consent. There's no question what's occurring here. The only people denying this are the crooks who are implicated in it.
Right. I think the data that's needed is the numbers ticking across the screen. Like we saw COVID cases and COVID deaths on TV every single day. We should have data of heart attacks and myocarditis and miscarriages and so forth. Dr. Biss, I wanted to follow up some questions with you, particularly about women that are breastfeeding their babies that are vaccinated. Do you know of any side effects they're seeing in their babies that they're breastfeeding that may be transmitted through breast milk? Have there any studies on that?
Personally, I don't have any data on my patient population, but I know in the spring of this year, there was a huge number of babies admitted. It might have been Scotland. It was somewhere over in the UK with myocarditis, newborns that were breastfeeding.
Have you ever heard of babies with myocarditis?
No, but I'm sure it's normal. Like heart attacks in pediatric age patients is apparently normal. So.
I know. I'm sorry. I was just stunned. I've never heard of a baby with myocarditis.
Nor have I.
And this is actually happening. The FDA authorized the use of Moderna and Pfizer COVID-19 vaccines for children 6 months and up on June 15th, 2022, followed by CDC recommendation on June 18th of 2022. At what age, and I'll go with any of y'all, at what age is it suitable for children to be vaccinated for COVID, Dr. Biss? Do you think it's...
I don't feel that anybody should get these vaccines because they're not safe and effective. They didn't do as promised. They're causing harm. But the infection fatality rate in somebody the age 0, meaning birth to 19 years of age, is 0.003%, which is 3 in a million children will die if they get a COVID infection. So why are we giving them a vaccine for this?
I completely agree. It's shocking. Dr. Malone, do you see any reason for children to receive these vaccines?
So it's been the position of myself and the physicians that I'm affiliated with, Physician Health Associates and the Global COVID Summit, as of about 2 years ago, that we believe that these products are neither safe nor effective and should be withdrawn across the board, even for the elderly. We do have the doctor focused on your questions would have mentioned that the FDA is now acknowledging that seizures are a side effect, a known side effect that raises above the threshold level associated with the product in the very young. They also have acknowledged without consequence that the recommendations for dosing, I think it was the Moderna product, were quite a bit higher than what they should have been for the pediatric population. And this just seems to be blithely dismissed as nothing. There's, she mentioned this case fatality rate that's extremely low, and she didn't mention that of those very few children that die, in one study that attempted to identify those children, there were none that were identified that didn't have major pre-existing conditions. So these are not healthy children. That adverse event or death case fatality rate that she's talking about, these are children that already were on death's door from other causes. And this gets to another one of the core lies, that we've had 1 million dead from COVID in the United States. That is false data. The case fatality rate in Sweden, where they did not impose all of these non-pharmaceutical and pharmaceutical interventions, is 0.023%. And what that equates to is we lost perhaps at most something in the range of 171,000 Americans to COVID. Other studies have estimated, rigorous studies have estimated that we had in the range, if you take the effects of the suppression of early treatment, the non-pharmaceutical interventions like the lockdowns, et cetera, plus the vaccines, we have in excess of 500,000 deaths in the United States at a minimum attributed to these top-down management measures imposed by the government.
Tyrannical government.
We have far more, that the data increasingly are demonstrating that we have far more death, just not in the pediatric cohort, but across the board, of American citizens as a consequence of these authoritarian measures that have been imposed in a top-down fashion, compared to those that can actually be attributed to the virus, as opposed to people that have died with the virus based on a PCR test, and the financial incentives that perverse financial incentives that we put in place for over-reporting. And it's fascinating, while I'm on that topic, if you look at the report of deaths in the United States, track those data, what you find is when those financial incentives expired, suddenly, within days, the event rate of death in the United States plummeted, illustrating again that we were incentivizing over-reporting of death with COVID as death from COVID.
So really quick to that point, Ernest Ramirez's 16-year-old son, Ernesto, yeah, I've met Ernest as well in Kentucky at a summit. His son died 5 days after receiving the Pfizer vaccine, and then he was contacted by FEMA, who said that they would pay for his son's burial if he would claim that his son had died of COVID. It's disgusting.
I wanted to get back to the child deaths in our country. Marty Macri out of Johns Hopkins demonstrated in the year 2020 that we had deaths in the pediatric population was somewhere in the 300s. But when you drill it down, most of them had stage 4 leukemias, they were already going to pass away. There was not one child that died simply because they had COVID in 2020. We had that. There was no reason why they needed to be vaccinated.
Thank you. This is, in my opinion, the worst thing that's ever happened to our country in my lifetime and the world. And the government's role cannot be denied. And I share all of your sentiment, as well as most Americans that are outraged and angered and continue to be angered over the fact that no one has ever been held accountable, and that it continues today. These vaccines are still mandated. I thank you, Dr. Biss, Dr. Malone, Mr. Renz. Thank you so much. Thank you, Congressman Massie. That we had other members that were here today that, due to different scheduling, they couldn't stay. They very much wanted to talk to you, and they apologized that they had to leave. So this concludes our hearing, and we will be having more of these hearings for anyone that's watching this. I plan to continue this. I know Congressman Massie will be involved, and so will many other members. I think it will grow, and that is my intention, to push this issue here in Congress, where it's continued to be silenced, pushed aside, and nobody wants to talk about it. So thank you so much.
Vaccines are safe. Very, very, very low risk of getting a myocarditis.
If you are not vaccinated, you remain at risk.
Comedian Nick Nemiroff dead at age 32. Teen equestrian star Sienna Knowles hospitalized with blood clots after Pfizer vaccine. You've done one hell of a job in making sure that they've made a lot of money. And I yield back.
We need to put these people in jail.
The vaccine industry is disgusting.
The American government, there's no shame.
An FDA investigation into safety issues.
They triggered a very comprehensive review of all databases in existence, and they discovered nothing.
That's it right there. This is not a conspiracy theory.
I should be prosecuted.